The emergency room went dead silent when a 23-year-old nurse grabbed the radiologist's arm and said, flat and certain, "Run that scan and he dies in 4 minutes." Nobody moved. Then Dr. Raymond Holt laughed. "Security," he said, without looking up from his clipboard. "Get her out of my ER." What happened next would be broadcast on national television within 48 hours. The nurse they dragged toward the exit had once pulled 3 soldiers out of a burning vehicle under active fire in a country most of these people couldn't find on a map. She had a commendation she never talked about, and a service record that didn't appear in any civilian database. And the man on that gurney, the one they were about to destroy with a routine CT scan, was carrying intelligence that 14 government agencies were currently fighting over. Nobody in that room knew any of that yet. They were about to find out. If this story already has you locked in, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button because what's coming in the next 4 parts is going to hit harder than anything I've put out. Stay with me until the end. You will want to be here for this. The morning had started the way most mornings started at Harlow General Hospital in the city of Denton Falls. Understaffed, overlit, and running 40 minutes behind schedule before 8 a.m. had even properly arrived. Nurse Mara Voss clocked in at 6:42, same as always, beating half the day shift by nearly 30 minutes because the parking structure on the east side of the building charged a lower rate before 7, and she was still working through her certification loans. She changed into scrubs in the women's locker room, pulled her dark blonde hair back with the same elastic band she'd been reusing for 3 days because she kept forgetting to buy more, and poured herself a coffee from the break room machine that produced something approximately in the neighborhood of coffee if you committed to not thinking about it too hard. She was 23 years old. She looked younger. That was the first problem, and it was a problem that presented itself every single shift without exception. The floor was already moving when she came through the double doors at 7:04. A pediatric intake on the left, an elderly patient in Bay 3 refusing to let anyone take blood, a chest pain in triage that the attending on nights had flagged as likely anxiety but probable cardiac workup anyway. The charge nurse, a large, steady man named Garrett, who had been working this floor for 9 years and had the particular exhausted competence of someone who had seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it, handed her a tablet without looking up from his own. Bay 2 needs a new IV. Bay 5 is waiting on a medication reconciliation from last night's transfer. Nobody did it. Bay 7 is a 34-year-old with a broken wrist who keeps trying to leave before we can cast it. He finally looked at her. "Morning." "Morning," she said. "Bay 5 I already filed at 7:03. He looked at her, then at his tablet, then back at her. "How did you—" "You know what? Never mind." He moved on. That was how it went. How it had been going since October, when she'd transferred to Harlow General from Mercy North on the other side of the city. Mercy North had been understaffed too, had smelled the same way. Antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular tension of too many sick people and not enough hands. But the senior attending there, a tired woman named Dr. Felicia Park, who ran on protein bars and blunt language, had at least noticed when Mara caught a potassium imbalance that 2 other nurses had flagged as normal and moved on from. Felicia had said, "Good catch, Voss," and gone back to her charting, which wasn't much of an acknowledgement in the grand scheme of things, but was something. Harlow General was different in one specific way that mattered. Dr. Raymond Holt. He arrived at 7:14 with a tablet tucked under his arm, and the expression of a man who believed the hospital ran because of his presence in it, which was not technically untrue given his position as chief of emergency medicine, but which he wore with a confidence that left no room for the contributions of anyone else. 48 years old, board certified, twice featured in the Denton Falls Courier for his work modernizing the department's triage protocols, which Mara had come to understand meant he had digitized a system that had functioned adequately on paper and added 2 additional approval steps between clinical observation and treatment decision. He was not a bad doctor. She had been watching him for 6 months, and she could say that honestly. He was technically precise, methodical, consistent with an established protocol. He did not make the kinds of obvious errors that ended careers. He had excellent instincts within the range of situations he had encountered before. What he could not do, and showed no interest in developing the capacity to do, was adapt when something fell outside that range. He noticed her at the nursing station and his expression didn't shift, which was its own form of commentary. Voss. He set his tablet on the counter without stopping. Bay 3 needs updated vitals. The last entry is from 11 p.m. Done at 6:50, she said. Should be in the system. He kept walking. That was the whole of their interaction most mornings. He spoke to her only when he thought she was behind on something, and when she demonstrated she wasn't. He moved on without registering it. She was a young blonde nurse with blue eyes and a quiet manner, which meant that in his mind she occupied a specific, limited professional category, and he saw no reason to look harder. 6 months had not changed that assessment. She had stopped expecting it to. By 9 o'clock, the floor had settled into the particular rhythm of a busy morning. Controlled chaos was the phrase people used, which she'd always thought was slightly misleading because chaos by definition wasn't controlled. But the phrase captured something true about the texture of it, the way emergencies arrived in clusters, and then went quiet, and then arrived again, and you learned to move through both the noise and the silence with the same pace. She liked it. She was built for it. Not in a way she ever articulated because that was the kind of thing that sounded strange if you said it out loud, but she felt it physically. The way her body organized itself when the intake radio went off. The way her attention narrowed and clarified rather than spreading thin. She was in Bay 7 negotiating with the 34-year-old wrist fracture whose name was Marcus, and who had a very compelling personal reason he needed to be at his kid's soccer game by 11. And who seemed to believe that this was information the radius bone would find relevant when the radio at the main desk came through loud enough to cut across the ambient noise of the floor. Harlow General, this is Denton Falls EMS Unit 7. Inbound with an unidentified male, approximate age mid-30s. Found unresponsive in a vehicle on Route 9 near the Kelmore overpass. No identification, no wallet, no phone. GCS was 6 on scene, currently holding at 7, but we're watching a downward trend. Vitals are doing something we haven't seen before. A pause, brief but full. Requesting your best eyes on arrival. ETA 3.5 minutes. Garrett's voice on the response. Copy that, Unit 7. Can you characterize the presentation further? That's the thing. The EMS voice had something in it now that wasn't quite uncertainty. It was more like the careful tone of a professional describing something they knew was real, but didn't yet have the vocabulary for. Pupils are unequal, but not in the standard traumatic pattern. He's twitching, but it's not a seizure. Cardiac's irregular in a way that doesn't match any arrhythmia I can name. Doctor, Caswell rode with us from scene, and he's here and he's looking at me like he wants me to have an answer, and I don't. Mara was already setting down Marcus's chart. I'll be back, she told him. What about your wrist is fractured in 2 places. The soccer game will happen without you. She was already through the bay curtain. Stay. She moved to the main desk and stood next to Garrett, watching the ambulance bay camera feed on the wall monitor. The vehicle was visible at the far end of the access road, moving fast, lights running. Something was settling in her chest. Not alarm, not yet. Something quieter. A particular quality of attention that she recognized as the state her mind went into when a situation required it. A sharpening of focus that other people sometimes mistook for coldness. She pulled on gloves and walked out to the ambulance bay to wait. The doors swung open 1 minute and 50 seconds later. Dr. Caswell came out first, compact, silver-haired, mid-50s, a physician with solid hospital experience in a manner that suggested he did not easily rattle. He was rattled now. He was hiding it well, the way experienced clinicians learn to, but she could see it in the set of his shoulders and the way he started talking before he'd finished climbing out. GCS 7 and holding, but the trend is down. BP was 94/60 on scene. We're at 88/58 now, and the drop is consistent and unexplained. Pupils are 2 millimeters right, 4 millimeters left, both sluggish. Intermittent tremor in the left hand, peripheral distribution, not central. No trauma visible, no odor on scene that would suggest intoxication, no medication bottles in the vehicle. What does the forearm skin look like? Mara said. Caswell paused mid-stride. Slightly pale. Dorsal surface of both forearms. Is it general pallor or localized? A beat. Localized. Why? She didn't answer. She moved to the back of the ambulance and looked at the patient before the gurney was fully out. male, mid-30s, built in a way that said his fitness was functional rather than recreational. The lean, load-bearing build of someone whose physical condition was a professional requirement, not a personal interest. Short brown hair, no visible injury, face slack in unconsciousness, but not peaceful. The specific blankness of a body spending all its resources on systems that mattered more than expression. His left hand lay palm up on the gurney rail, fingers partially curled. The tremor, when it came, was subtle. A fine oscillation in the fingers, lasting maybe 2 seconds, then stopping. Mara leaned in close to the man's neck without touching him, and breathed in once, careful and deliberate. There, under the antiseptic, under the smell of the ambulance and the recycled air, something bitter and slightly chemical. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong. The way wrong smells are wrong before you can name why. A faint metallic top note with something beneath it that was almost ozone, almost electrical. She knew that smell. She straightened up and turned to the paramedic beside her. Torres, according to the name tag, young woman with dark hair and sharp eyes, who was watching Mara with the look of someone deciding how much weight to give what they were seeing. "Did you notice an odor at the scene?" Mara said. "In the vehicle or on the patient?" Torres thought about it for half a second. "Yeah, I thought it was the car. Something faint, kind of bitter." "Thank you," Mara said. She turned to Garrett, who had come out to meet them. "We need to hold on the CT." Garrett's face did something complicated. "Holt already ordered it. Head and cervical plus chest. Radiology is prepped. I need 5 minutes before we move him to imaging." "Mara, I can't." "5 minutes, Garrett. Just hold the transport." "Talk to Holt," he said, which was not an answer but was technically accurate advice. She found Holt inside the trauma bay reviewing the EMS report on his tablet, already mentally arranging the sequence of procedures with the confident efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, which, in most circumstances, was exactly what he was. That was the part that made this difficult. "Dr. Holt," she said, "I need you to hold the CT on the incoming patient." He looked up. Voss. He said her name the way he always said it, without warmth, without hostility, without much of anything. A label, not a greeting. "Unless you're here to assist intake, step aside." "I'm here because I think the CT is going to kill him." That got a reaction, though not the one she needed. His eyes moved from his tablet to her face with the particular attention of someone deciding how to handle a subordinate who has said something they consider disproportionate. "Based on what?" "Based on his symptom cluster and a chemical odor I identified on scene. His presentation, the pupil differential, the peripheral tremor distribution, the specific BP drop pattern, the skin presentation on his forearms. It's consistent with a compound that reacts to ionizing radiation. If you run that CT, the radiation exposure triggers a cascade in the inhibitor protein, and he could go from GCS7 to cardiac arrest on the table. The window for that deterioration is fast, under 5 minutes. Debran. Silence in the immediate vicinity. Torres was watching. Caswell had gone still. Holt said, "A chemical compound that reacts to ionizing radiation." "Yes." "Which you identified based on a smell." "And the symptom presentation." "The smell was one component." "Where did you study pharmacology, Voss?" She knew where this was going. She'd known where it was going before she opened her mouth, which was why she'd opened her mouth anyway. Because the alternative was worse. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I didn't study pharmacology in a formal program, but I've encountered this presentation before in a different context, and I know what I'm looking at." "A different context," he repeated in the tone of someone repeating something back to demonstrate how little it means. "I appreciate that you're paying attention. That's good nursing. But the CT is standard protocol for an altered consciousness presentation with unknown etiology, and I'm not going to delay imaging on a deteriorating patient because a floor nurse has a feeling." She opened her mouth. He didn't let her. "Get me a second IV line on his right arm," he said, turning away, "and pull the crash cart to Bay 1 as a precaution." He walked toward the gurney. Mara stood still for exactly 2 seconds. She ran the calculation she already knew the answer to, the one she'd been running since the ambulance bay, the one that had only one conclusion, no matter which direction she approached it from. She went to find the controlled substances room. The corridor between Trauma Bay 1 and the pharmacy annex was 40 steps. She'd counted it in her first week, the way she counted all the routes, an old reflex that had never gone dormant. The controlled substances room was locked with a key card and a secondary pin, and her access was on file because she was listed on the dispensing authorization, and nobody had processed her termination yet because Holt hadn't officially filed it. He'd said the words, but words weren't paperwork, and paperwork was what actually revoked access. She used her card. The door opened. 4 medications. 2 she could authorize under standing nursing protocol. 2 required attending countersignature, which she did not have and was not going to get. She opened the log to the current page, found the relevant entries, and signed her name next to each one. Clearly, completely, with the date and time recorded to the minute. Not because she thought the signature would protect her, it wouldn't, not legally, but because if she was right, the documentation was going to be examined by people who needed to see that she had known exactly what she was doing and had done it deliberately, not in a panic, not by accident. She loaded the medications onto a tray and walked back. Garrett saw her coming, and his expression did the thing it did when he was about to say something he didn't want to say. "Mara, I know," she said. "I'm going in anyway." "He's going to have you removed." "I know that too." She pushed through the doors. The room was in the organized motion of a trauma intake. Nurses on both sides of the gurney, monitors being attached, Caswell calling out the updated readings, Holt at the head of the bed directing the sequence with the calm authority of someone who had done this 1,000 times and expected to do it 1,000 more. The transport aide was by the door, waiting for the signal to move the patient to radiology. "Voss." Holt didn't look up. "You were asked to leave this floor. I have 4 medications that will stabilize this patient," she said. She kept her voice even and carried the tray where the room could see it. "I need 2 minutes to administer the first 2, and I need you to hold imaging for 40 minutes after that. If I'm wrong, his condition is unchanged, and you proceed with the CT. If I'm right, you still proceed with the CT in 40 minutes, but the compound has been neutralized and the scan is safe. Remove her," Holt said to Polk, who had materialized near the door. Polk looked at Mara. She looked back at him. He was a decent man doing a job, and she did not hold what came next against him. "I'm asking you not to move this patient until I've administered the first medication," she said, addressing the room more than any one person in it. "If anyone in this room wants to call a second opinion, nobody is calling anything," Holt said sharply. He turned to face her fully now, and the temperature in the room dropped 3 degrees. "You are a terminated employee who has removed controlled substances from a locked dispensary without authorization. I'm calling security, and I'm calling the nursing board, and I'm calling hospital legal. And you are going to hand me that tray." She looked at Caswell. He was watching the monitor. His eyes were fixed on something in the waveform that she couldn't see from her angle, and his expression had shifted. The professional mask was still there, but something beneath it was recalculating. "Raymond?" Caswell said. "Not now, David." His pupils. Everyone looked at the patient. In the 30 seconds they'd been focused on her, the patient's left pupil had dilated further. 3 millimeters to 5. The differential had increased. The cardiac waveform on the monitor was showing a new irregularity in the ST segment. Minor, subtle, the kind of thing that was easy to attribute to artifact, except that it had appeared in the last 90 seconds and the patient hadn't been moved. "He's accelerating," Mara said quietly. Holt's jaw was tight. He said nothing. "Dr. Holt." She held his gaze. "I am asking you one more time." The monitor alarmed. Not flatline. A sustained arrhythmia alert, the kind that made the room shift involuntarily, the kind that meant the system was telling you something had changed faster than you'd expected. Holt looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. He looked at Mara. "Do it," he said. The words came out like something he was biting through. She was already moving. IV access right antecubital, established in the field, still patent. She flushed it once and administered the first medication in a slow, controlled push, watching his face, watching the monitor, talking under her breath the way she always did. Not for anyone else's benefit, but because externalizing the sequence kept the variables organized. First medication in, watching for pupil response in 90 seconds. Second going in now at half rate. "What is that compound?" Caswell said, from directly beside her. not accusing, genuinely asking. Chelation base with a modified ionization inhibitor, she said. The inhibitor crosses the blood-brain barrier and binds to the degraded protein before radiation can trigger the cascade. You won't find it in standard pharmacological references. Where will I find it? She didn't answer that. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has shifted and nobody has fully named it yet. Polk had not removed her. Holt had not repeated the order. Two nurses who had been watching her with undisguised skepticism were now watching the monitor with a different expression. 70 seconds after the first administration, one of the nurses said, "His pupils!" The differential was closing. Slowly, not dramatically, not in a way that would make good television, just the quiet biological fact of a treatment beginning to work. The left pupil contracting by 0.5 millimeter towards symmetry. Nobody in the room said anything. Mara administered the third medication, adjusted the drip rate on the fourth, checked the cardiac trace. The ST irregularity was flattening. The arrhythmia alert had gone silent, the rhythm returning towards something that looked like a heart doing its job instead of arguing with itself. She checked his response to verbal stimulus. "Can you hear me?" she said, close to his face. Nothing. But the GCS indicators were different. The lack of response was the stillness of a body resting, not losing. She stood up straight and breathed out once. "He needs the fourth medication in 40 minutes, she said to the room. "Dosing is on the tray label. He should stay off imaging for a minimum of 6 hours. After that, it's safe to proceed with standard protocol." She looked at Caswell. "His tox panel is going to come back clean on every standard screen. The compound doesn't flag. If you want confirmation, there's a CDC contact line for military-grade toxicology consultations. I can write it down." She set the tray on the instrument table. Holt was standing at the foot of the bed. He hadn't moved in 4 minutes. He was looking at the monitor, and then at the patient, and then at nothing in particular, the expression of a man whose map of the situation no longer matched the territory. "Voss," he said. She had picked up her badge from the counter and was putting it in her pocket. "How did you know that compound?" She thought about the medical tent. She thought about the man who had died before anyone understood what was happening to him. She thought about what it cost to carry knowledge that had a context you couldn't explain without explaining everything about who you used to be and why you didn't talk about it. "I've seen it before," she said. She walked out. The corridor was quieter than the trauma bay. She moved through it at a measured pace, her hand steady, the particular flatness of post-adrenaline beginning to settle in. Not exhaustion, just the even plane of after. She had done what needed doing. The rest was going to be what it was going to be. She was 15 steps from the exit when her phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at it for 1 ring. 2. Answered. "Is this the nurse who treated the patient from the Kelmore overpass?" Male voice. Controlled, measured, the flat cadence of someone accustomed to conveying authority without inflection. "Who's calling?" "That's not the important question right now. The important question is whether you are still in the building." She stopped walking. "I've been terminated. I'm heading to my car. I need you to go back inside." A pause that lasted precisely the right amount of time to feel deliberate. The patient you treated is not a civilian, and what you just did in that trauma bay, that's going to need to be explained to some people who are already on their way. On their way from where? But she was already looking through the glass doors at the end of the corridor, not because anything had drawn her attention there, but because that was what she did in any environment. She tracked the exits, the approach vectors, the sky where she could see it. The sky above the parking lot was pale blue and completely clear. October in Denton Falls, cold light, the kind of morning that looked clean and simple from a distance. She saw the shape before she heard it, a dark form at the far edge of visible sky, low and moving fast with a forward speed that said it wasn't coming to hover over anything. It was coming in, committed and deliberate, and it was not a news helicopter or a medevac transport because the rotor sound that arrived 2 seconds later had a weight and a frequency that she recognized not from formal training, but from the specific education of having been in places where that sound meant something specific was about to happen. Military rotorcraft, heavy class, moving at a speed that meant someone had given clearance nobody in this building had been consulted about. The phone was still at her ear. "That's yours," she said. It wasn't a question. "Go back inside, Ms. Voss," the voice said. And please make sure no one moves that patient. She was already turning around. Behind her, through the trauma bay doors 40 steps away, she heard the cardiac monitor alarm go off. Not the sustained arrhythmia tone, something different, faster, the rapid cascade of multiple threshold alerts triggering in sequence, which meant something had changed in the last 90 seconds, and it had changed fast. She ran. She ran, not the self-conscious jog of someone trying not to look panicked in a professional environment. The actual run of someone for whom running toward a problem was the oldest trained response she had. Her shoes hit the linoleum hard, and she covered the 40 steps in about 4 seconds and hit the trauma bay doors with her shoulder. The scene inside had changed. The monitor was showing a cascade she recognized from the pattern of alarms. 3 threshold breaches in rapid succession: cardiac, respiratory, and neurological. The kind of simultaneous degradation that didn't happen from one cause but from a system under coordinated attack. 2 nurses were already repositioning at the bedside. Caswell was calling out numbers with the controlled urgency of someone trying to stay ahead of what was happening. Holt was at the head of the bed with both hands braced on the rail, watching the monitor with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the professional composure of a man managing a situation, but the stripped-down look of someone who had run out of framework. "What happened?" she said, crossing to the IV stand. 60 seconds ago, nothing," Torres said from the corner where she'd stayed after the handoff, watching. "Then everything." Mara checked the medication drip. Rate was correct. She checked the IV line. Patent, no infiltration, the fluid moving the way it should. She looked at the waveform on the cardiac monitor and saw something that shouldn't have been there given what she'd administered. A secondary irregularity beneath the arrhythmia she'd already addressed. A deeper flutter in the baseline that the first protocol hadn't touched. Because the first protocol had been designed for a single compound exposure. She understood in the space of about 1.5 seconds. "He was dosed twice," she said. Caswell turned. "What?" "2 compounds. Sequenced." She was already moving to the medication tray, running through what she had left, what was available in this room, what the timing required. "The first dose I treated was the primary agent, the one that reacts to radiation. This second presentation is a delayed release component. Different mechanism. It's been in his system the whole time, just on a timer." "A timer," Holt repeated. His voice had lost the quality she associated with him. The authority was still there, but it was hollow. 30-minute delay from initial exposure. We're at... She looked at the wall clock. "We're just inside the window. I need epinephrine. I need the second inhibitor from the tray, and I need someone to get me a manual pressure reading because I don't trust the cuff sensor right now." A nurse named Priya, who had been watching Mara with an expression that had moved over the last 20 minutes from skepticism to something more open, moved immediately to the blood pressure cuff. Nobody waited for Holt to confirm the order. That was a shift that had happened somewhere in the last quarter hour without anyone announcing it, and Mara noted it the way she noted most things, as information, not as validation. She worked. The second compound was nastier than the first, in the way that something engineered to be a failsafe is always nastier than the primary agent. It didn't need a radiation trigger because it was designed to finish the job if the first mechanism failed. Whoever had dosed this man had been thorough. They had accounted for medical intervention. They had assumed someone might identify the first compound and treat it, and they had installed a backup that didn't care. That level of planning said something about who this patient was and how badly someone wanted him dead. She filed that thought and kept working. 90/62, Priya said. Okay, that's workable. She adjusted the epinephrine dose down by 1/4, recalculated the inhibitor timing, made a call she wasn't entirely certain about regarding the rate on the second drip. A judgment call based on body weight estimate and symptom timing, the kind of calculation that didn't have a textbook answer in this context because there was no textbook for this context, because this compound did not officially exist in civilian pharmacological literature. She gave the drip a rate of 8 and watched the monitor. 20 seconds. 40. The flutter in the baseline didn't disappear, but it slowed. The cascade alert stopped triggering new thresholds. The cardiac waveform began its return towards something she could work with. Okay, she said, very quietly, just to herself. A word that meant keep going, not that it's over. The trauma bay doors banged open. The sound was different from how doors normally opened. Not someone pushing through, but something more deliberate, more sudden. And the two figures who came through were not hospital personnel. They were wearing civilian clothes, dark and unmarked, but they moved the way military personnel moved in confined spaces, with an efficiency of motion and a spatial awareness that said the room had been assessed and its occupants categorized before they'd fully crossed the threshold. Behind them came a third person. He was tall, not in a way that dominated the room, but in the way of someone who was accustomed to being the tallest person present and had stopped registering it. Silver-haired, mid-60s, wearing a dark overcoat over what was clearly a dress uniform, the kind of military formal that didn't get worn for routine situations. 4 stars on the shoulder. His face was lined and unremarkable in the way that faces become when they've held authority long enough that the authority has settled into the bones rather than the expression. He stopped inside the door and scanned the room. His eyes found the patient first, the way eyes always go to what they came for. Then they moved across the assembled staff, Caswell, Holt, the nurses, Torres in the corner, with the measured assessment of someone categorizing a scene, and then they found Mara. He went still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of recognition, which is a different thing. "Medic Voss," he said. The room had already been quiet. It went quieter. The monitor beeped. Someone's shoe squeaked against the linoleum, and whoever it was stopped moving. Mara looked at the man in the doorway and felt something complex move through her chest. Not fear, not quite relief, something in between those things that didn't have a clean name. "General Aldrin," she said. Holt looked from the general to Mara, then back. Then his expression did something she hadn't seen it do before. It collapsed slightly, the architecture of certainty losing a load-bearing element. "You know each other," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Nobody answered him directly. General Warren Aldrin crossed the room in 8 steps and stood at the foot of the patient's bed, looking at the man on it with an expression that was, for just a moment, not the face of a general, but the face of someone looking at a person they knew. "What's his status?" Aldrin said. "Stabilizing," Mara said. "Dual compound exposure. I've addressed both agents, but I need another 30 minutes before I can confirm the secondary is fully neutralized. He needs to stay off imaging until then." "Understood." He turned to the 2 men who'd come in with him and said 2 words she didn't catch, and they moved to positions near the bay doors without comment. "Who is he?" Caswell said. Aldrin looked at him. "That information is classified." "I'm his treating physician." "Was," one of the men by the door said, and it wasn't aggressive, just factual, in the way that the end of something is just factual. Caswell closed his mouth. He looked at Mara. She looked back at him with an expression she hoped communicated that this was not personal, that she understood his position, and that she also could not help him with it. "I'm going to need to know who gave him these compounds," Aldrin said, turning back to Mara. His voice was low enough that it didn't carry to the edges of the room. "And I'm going to need to know the delivery mechanism. Can you estimate exposure time from presentation?" "Between 90 minutes and 3 hours before arrival. The primary compound was at peak activation. The secondary was on a delay trigger, so there's a definable window of original exposure." 3 hours, Aldrin said. He looked at the clock on the wall. "That puts dosing between 7 and 8 this morning. If I had to narrow it, I'd say 7:30. He nodded once, the slow nod of someone adding a piece to a pattern they've been building for a while. Holt had not moved from the head of the bed. He said, "Can someone explain to me what is happening in my emergency room?" Aldrin looked at him with the particular patience of a man who had given bad news many times and had learned to give it without ornamentation. "Your emergency room is currently part of an active federal investigation, Dr. Holt, Raymond Holt. I am the chief of emergency medicine in this hospital." "Dr. Holt." Aldrin said the name the way Holt had said Mara's name all morning, as a label placed precisely. 40 minutes ago, you ordered a CT scan on this patient. Standard protocol for altered. If Nurse Voss had not intervened, that scan would have killed a United States military officer carrying active mission intelligence. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. I want to make sure you understand that I'm not characterizing that as an error in judgment. I'm characterizing it as the outcome that someone intended. The room temperature dropped. "What does that mean?" Holt said. "It means we have questions," Aldrin said. For quite a few people in this building. He turned away from Holt with a finality that was more dismissive than anything words could have achieved and addressed Mara again. The team outside is setting up a secondary medical station. As soon as he's stable enough to move without risk, I want to relocate him. I need your assessment of transfer readiness. 90 minutes minimum, she said. He nodded. I'll need you with him. I've been terminated. He looked at her, then slowly at Holt. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds, which was long enough to be unambiguous. I think, Aldrin said, we can work around that. It was at that moment that the patient moved. Not much. A shift in his right hand, the fingers curling against the bed rail. A small, involuntary motion that said the body was beginning to find its way back to the surface. But then his head turned slowly toward the cluster of activity at the foot of his bed, and his eyes opened. Brown. The same brown eyes Mara had seen briefly when he'd surfaced 40 minutes ago, but clearer now, with more behind them. He took in the ceiling, the monitor, the faces. His gaze traveled and found Aldrin, and something moved across his face. Recognition first, then a complicated relief that a man in his condition was probably not intending to show but couldn't suppress. His mouth moved. The first attempt at sound didn't produce one. He swallowed, tried again. Warren, he said. His voice was rough and thin, and nothing like what it normally was, probably, but it carried. Aldrin moved to the side of the bed. The professional composure was still there, but it had acquired something else, something that looked like it might be the careful management of something more personal. Reyes, he said. Don't talk yet. The drive, the patient, Reyes said. He was ignoring the instruction the way people ignore instructions when they have something they consider more urgent than their own physical state. It's in the lining of the... He coughed, a harsh, productive sound, and one of the nurses moved forward, but Mara caught her arm and shook her head slightly. Let him finish. Left boot, the heel. Don't let them... We have it, Aldrin said. We have it, Marcus. It's secure. The man whose name was apparently Marcus Reyes closed his eyes. He didn't relax exactly. His jaw was still tight, and his breathing was still effortful. But something released across his forehead, the tension of carrying a specific burden shifting off. Marcus, Mara thought, she had a patient in Bay 7 with that name too. The wrist fracture. He was probably still in there waiting. She filed that thought somewhere and returned to the monitor. His BP is 94/68, Priya said quietly, appearing at Mara's shoulder. Better. Keep watching it. If it drops below 85 systolic, get me. Priya nodded and moved back to the monitor station without being asked twice, which was something Mara had noticed about her. She was the kind of nurse who actually heard what you said and acted on it, rather than waiting for a second confirmation. Not everyone was. You learned to value the ones who were. Aldrin had stepped back from the bedside and was on a phone call, turned partly away from the room, his voice low. The two men by the door were doing the thing that trained personnel did in holding positions, looking relaxed while being completely alert, a specific kind of stillness that was actually a coiled readiness. Holt was still in the room. He shouldn't have been, or at least that was the unspoken communication from the men by the door, but he hadn't moved, and nobody had physically removed him, and he was standing near the wall with his tablet in his hand and his arms at a slight defensive angle, the body language of a man trying to process a situation that had reorganized itself around him. Mara noticed him the way she noticed everything, as a data point, something to track, a variable in the room. Then the hospital's legal counsel arrived. Donna Fitch was a small woman in her early 50s who wore her silver-streaked hair pulled back and carried herself with the specific energy of someone who spent her days at the intersection of bad news and institutional liability and had learned to arrive first. She came through the trauma bay doors at a pace that said someone had called her, and she had not walked to this floor. She had moved. She took in the room in 3 seconds. Her eyes went to Aldrin's uniform, then to the men by the door, then to Holt, then to Mara, and in the sequence of those glances was a story about what she'd been told on the phone versus what she was seeing. Dr. Holt, she said, landing on him because he was the most familiar element and the most immediately relevant. I need to speak with you. Donna, Holt said, and there was something in the way he said it. Relief, possibly. The kind that comes from familiar authority arriving in an unfamiliar situation. Not here, she said. My office. I'm in the middle of Raymond. She said his first name the way that meant she was not making a suggestion. Now. He looked at the general. The general was still on his phone and did not look at Holt. He looked at Mara. She was adjusting the medication drip and not looking at anyone. He looked at his tablet, which offered him nothing. He went with Donna Fitch. The doors closed behind them. Caswell said, from his position near the equipment wall where he had spent the last several minutes being an extremely quiet observer, "Is someone going to tell me what's happening, or am I supposed to infer it?" "Infer it," one of the men by the door said, and his tone was not unfriendly, which somehow made it more final. Caswell looked at Mara. "He'll be okay," she said. "That's what I can tell you." "Is it enough?" She thought about it for a second. "Probably not, but it's what I've got." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man deciding to accept partial information, because the alternative was arguing with people in positions of authority, and he had enough experience with institutions to know that argument rarely produced additional information in these situations. Aldrin finished his call and came back to Mara's position near the I-5 stand. "I've got a team on the way from the DC field office," he said quietly, "just the two of them. They'll be here in 2 hours. Before they arrive, I need to brief you on what Reyes was carrying and why it matters, because once they get here, the conversation changes." "What do you mean, changes?" "I mean the federal investigators will run a procedural inquiry into everything that happened from the time Reyes was found to the time we secured him, and everyone in this room is going to be in that inquiry." He paused. "Including how he came to be dosed with a compound that is not supposed to exist in this country." She looked at him. "You're not just talking about who dosed him?" "No," he said. "I'm also talking about why he was brought to this hospital specifically." She turned that over. "You think someone inside the hospital knew who he was?" "I think someone knew what would happen if a standard scan was ordered on a patient with those compounds in his system." He said it carefully, factually, the way you said something that had moved from theory to working hypothesis. "And I think that person may have been counting on the standard protocol being followed without question." The implication of that settled into the room the way cold air settles, gradually, and then all at once. It meant the CT scan hadn't just been standard protocol. It had been the plan. It meant whoever had dosed Marcus Reyes had not left the rest to chance. They had planned for the hospital. They had anticipated the intake, the protocol, the attending's response. They had known that an unidentified male with altered consciousness would be wheeled into radiology within 40 minutes of arrival because that was exactly what protocol dictated, and the protocol had never failed them before. It also meant that somewhere in the chain from the Kelmore overpass to Trauma Bay 1, someone had made choices that weren't coincidental. Mara said, "Holt ordered the CT immediately." "Yes. Without atypical delay. That's what the report will show." She looked at the doors Holt had gone through. She looked at Reyes, whose chest was moving with the steady rhythm of a body working its way back from the edge. She looked at the monitor, which was showing numbers that, if not good, were no longer actively alarming. "How long has Reyes been on the active roster?" she said. 2 years with the unit. Before that, special operations. Before that, I don't have full clearance on his history, which is its own story." Aldrin looked at his patient. "He was coming in from a dead drop. He'd been in the field for 11 days. The intelligence he was carrying relates to a network we've been building a case against for 26 months. "What kind of network?" He looked at her. "Right," she said. She went back to her monitoring and said nothing else for a few minutes, because there was work to do and the questions she was building in her mind could wait until the work was done. That was the discipline. Put the questions in a row. Hold them there. Do the job in front of you first. It was 22 minutes later, while she was making notes on the medication log she'd started the moment she'd taken over Reyes's treatment, that Torres appeared at her elbow. The paramedic had been quiet for so long in the corner of the room that Mara had half stopped tracking her presence. "Can I ask you something?" Torres said. "Probably." "When you smelled that compound in the ambulance, you knew what it was right away." "Not immediately. I had to confirm with the symptom pattern. But you knew enough to go looking." "Yes." Torres was quiet for a moment. "How does a floor nurse at Harlow General know what a military-grade neurotoxin smells like?" Mara finished the notation she was writing and set down the pen. "She doesn't," she said. "A floor nurse at Harlow General doesn't know that." Torres looked at her. "Okay," Torres said, And then she went back to her corner and didn't ask anything else, which meant she was either very perceptive or very experienced or both. It was at the 38-minute mark, when Mara was preparing the final stabilizing dose and running the numbers on transfer readiness, that the doors opened again. She expected Aldrin's federal team arriving early, or possibly Donna Fitch returning with Holt and a hospital attorney and the kind of procedural energy that institutions generate when they feel threatened. She expected, in the back of her mind, for things to stay complicated in predictable ways. What she didn't expect was the man who came through the door ahead of the two federal agents. He was heavy-set and somewhere in his late 50s, wearing a suit that was expensive in the specific way of someone who was paid well to be unimportant looking. And his face was familiar in the way that faces are familiar when you've seen them in institutional photographs, but not in person. He carried a leather document case under one arm, and his expression was calibrated to suggest this was a professional call rather than something urgent, which was exactly the expression someone would work to maintain if it was extremely urgent. Mara recognized him after about 2 seconds. Dale Forsyth, hospital board chairman. She had seen his photograph in the administrative corridor between the founding director and the current CEO, and had noted his face with the same automatic cataloging she applied to all the architecture of any institution she worked within. He crossed to Aldrin without looking at anyone else in the room and spoke at a volume that was meant to be private, but in the specific hush of the trauma bay carried further than he probably intended. "Warren," he said, "I think we need to talk about how this is being handled." Aldrin turned from his phone screen and looked at Forsyth with an expression that didn't change. "Dale," he said, "the investigators you've got coming. I've been on the phone with the legal team, and there are some procedural concerns about jurisdiction that I think we should work through before—" "The jurisdiction is federal," Aldrin said. "There's nothing to work through." Forsyth's jaw moved once, a slight adjustment, the physical tell of a man regrouping. "The hospital has an obligation to its staff in these situations. Dr. Holt has been with this institution for 11 years, and the suggestion that he had any— Nobody has made a suggestion about Dr. Holt," Aldrin said. "Yet." That last word sat in the air between them like an object. Forsyth looked at the general. He looked at Reyes on the bed. He looked— And this was the thing Mara registered from her position 3 feet away, the thing she filed and held. He looked at Reyes the way you look at something that has not gone the way you needed it to go. Not with concern, not with the professional gravity of a board chairman confronted with a patient in his hospital, with something that landed, in the honest accounting of her gut, closer to frustration. She kept her hands moving on the medication preparation and kept her eyes on what she was doing, because the most important thing in this room right now was that Forsyth not know she had registered his expression. But she had registered it. She registered everything. Aldrin said something quietly to the 2 federal agents who had come in with Forsyth, and they moved to flank the door in a configuration that was polite but unambiguous. Forsyth stood in the center of the room for a moment with his document case under his arm, and then he said with great precision, "I'll be in my office," and left. The doors settled closed behind him. Mara said, without looking up from what she was doing, "You know him. Since 1998, Aldrin said. He didn't say anything else. She thought about that. She thought about the expression on Forsyth's face. She thought about a hospital board chairman who showed up in the trauma bay within 40 minutes of a federal general arriving by military helicopter, with procedural concerns about jurisdiction already prepared, with a leather document case that nobody had asked him to bring. She thought about the word Aldrin had used. Someone had been counting on the protocol being followed. Protocol started at the top. Protocols were institutional. Institutions had boards. She finished preparing the final dose and administered it, and said nothing. Reyes's eyes had opened again. He was looking at the ceiling with the specific unfocused attention of someone whose body had stabilized enough to let their mind start moving again, but who didn't have enough strength yet to direct where it went. His lips were slightly parted. His breathing was slow and even, and better than it had been at any point since his arrival. He turned his head and found her. She expected the look of a man who didn't know who she was. Instead, she got something else. The deliberate look of someone who had been conscious and listening longer than they'd let on. He held her gaze with a steadiness that said his GCS was considerably higher than his stillness had been advertising. His mouth moved. She leaned in. "Boot," he said, barely audible. Heel, left boot. Don't let Forsyth anywhere near it. She straightened up. She looked at Aldrin, who was across the room on another call and hadn't heard. She looked at Reyes, who had closed his eyes again. She looked at the door Forsyth had left through. Outside, somewhere on the floors above her, somewhere in the administrative quarter of this building where she had worked for 6 months and been invisible for 6 months, was a leather document case that a man had brought to a trauma bay without being asked. And somewhere in this hospital, she was becoming increasingly certain, was the chain of decisions that had put Marcus Reyes on that gurney. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She checked it under the lip of the medication tray, shielded from view. A text from the unknown number that had called her earlier. 5 words. Forsyth's office. Blue file. Tonight. She looked at it for 3 seconds. She deleted the message. She put the phone back in her pocket. She went back to monitoring her patient. But her mind had already moved past the trauma bay, past the corridor, past the administrative floor, was running the math on an institution, a board chairman with a leather case and a frustrated expression, and a man on a gurney who had been left on Route 9 to die in a sequence of events that someone had planned with enough precision to account for hospital intake protocol. Someone who knew this hospital. Someone who knew exactly how Raymond Holt ran his ER. The monitor beeped steady and even. Reyes breathed. Mara stood at the foot of his bed and kept her face neutral and thought about what she was going to do next, because the investigation that Aldrin's federal team was going to run in 2 hours was going to follow a procedural path, and procedural paths could be walked ahead of or behind, and she had a very particular set of skills for determining which of those was the right choice. She had made that determination. She looked at the clock. 1 hour and 41 minutes until the federal team arrived. She needed to move. She needed to move, and she had 1 hour and 41 minutes to do it in. And the first problem was that she couldn't leave Reyes. The second problem was that she couldn't ask anyone else to get into Forsyth's office without knowing what they were walking into, because she didn't know yet what she was walking into, and sending someone uninformed into a situation you didn't understand was how people got hurt. The third problem was that Aldrin was watching her, not overtly. He was on his phone again, turned toward the wall, running the operational logistics of whatever was moving toward this hospital from the direction of Washington. But the kind of man who made 4-star general didn't stop tracking a room when he turned away from it, and she knew that because she was the same way, and she'd learned it from people who were exactly like him. She worked through the logic while she worked through the medication schedule, one hand on the IV flow regulator, one eye on the monitor, the larger calculation running in the background where she'd always kept the calculations that couldn't be visible. Forsyth had arrived with a leather document case and procedural concerns about jurisdiction. He had looked at Reyes with frustration rather than alarm. He had left when Aldrin's response made clear that jurisdiction wasn't negotiable. None of that was conclusive. All of it was, in the specific vocabulary of pattern recognition she'd spent years developing, directional. Reyes had said, "Don't let Forsyth anywhere near the boot." That was conclusive. She checked the monitor, BP 98/66, trending slowly upward, respiratory rate 14 regular. GCSM. She ran a quick bedside assessment, pen light, verbal, motor response. She put him at 12, which was a 4-point improvement in the last 40 minutes and better than she'd expected at this stage. "You're improving," she said quietly, close to him. His eyes didn't open, but his head moved slightly, the micro-adjustment of someone registering sound and choosing not to respond to it yet, which told her his cognition was coming back faster than his body was, which was consistent with the compound she'd treated, and which also meant he was actively listening. "I heard you about the boot," she said, quieter. "I need you to tell me if Forsyth has access to the room where your personal effects are being held." A pause. His jaw moved. "Standard intake, he said, barely voiced. "Belongings go to the nurse station lockbox, 3rd floor. Who has a key?" "Charge nurse and administration." Administration. Which included the office of the board chairman. She straightened up and looked at Priya. "Can you watch the drip rate for me for 10 minutes? If the BP drops below 85 systolic, come get me immediately. Don't adjust the rate yourself." Priya looked at her steadily. "Where are you going?" "3rd floor." Priya nodded. No follow-up questions. The quality Mara had noted earlier and was now genuinely grateful for. She caught Garrett near the door. He'd come back into the trauma bay at some point in the last 20 minutes and had been doing what Garrett did in confusing situations, which was make himself useful in the background without requiring anyone to manage him. "The intake belongings from the Kelmore overpass patient," she said. "Where are they?" Garrett looked at her. He knew something was happening, had known it since the helicopter, and had dealt with his uncertainty about it in the most Garrett way possible, which was to continue doing his job and wait for someone to tell him what he needed to know. "Third floor lockbox," he said. "I processed it myself at intake. Walletless, phoneless. Just boots, a jacket, and a watch." "Is the lockbox secure right now?" "Should be. Code access plus physical key." He paused. "But Donna Fitch has an administrative override for the floor lockboxes. She used it twice last year for insurance documentation." Donna Fitch, who was currently with Holt in the legal counsel's office. Mara said, "I need you to call the third floor charge nurse and tell them not to open that lockbox for anyone until I get there." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the general across the room. He looked at the two federal agents by the door. He looked at the patient on the bed. "Okay," he said. She moved. The stairwell was faster than the elevator and less visible, which mattered in a building that was currently being observed by federal personnel and hospital administration simultaneously. She took the stairs at a pace that looked purposeful without looking rushed, a distinction that mattered because people running in hospitals attracted attention, and attention was not what she needed in the next 9 minutes. Third floor was medical administration and records, quieter than the ER floors. Institutional carpet instead of linoleum, slightly warmer lighting, the particular hush of a floor where the work was paperwork rather than bodies. The charge nurse station was at the far end of the corridor, a half-circle desk behind which a woman named Sandra was already on the phone when Mara arrived, looking at her with the slightly defensive expression of someone who had just received a confusing call from downstairs and was still processing it. "You're the one Garrett called about?" Sandra said. "Yes." He said, "Don't open the lockbox for anyone. Then you show up." She set the phone down. "You understand why I'm not automatically sure that's not contradictory." "It's not. I need to verify the contents are intact, not remove anything." Sandra looked at her badge. The badge that said Harlow General, which was technically no longer accurate given her employment status, but which she hadn't surrendered because no one had asked for it, and she had not volunteered it. "What's happening down there?" Sandra said. "We can hear the helicopter landed. There's a federal situation involving a patient. I can't give you more than that right now." Mara kept her voice even and direct. No performance, no urgency she couldn't justify, because Sandra was smart and would notice either. "But I need to see that lockbox." Sandra considered it for about 4 seconds, which was a shorter deliberation than the situation warranted, and which meant she had already formed a judgment about who Mara was and what was happening, and that judgment was favorable. She reached under the desk and produced a physical key. The lockbox was in a side room off the main corridor, a reinforced cabinet with a digital pad and a physical backup, standard for personal effects with potential evidentiary value. Sandra entered the code. The lock released. Mara opened it. Jacket, folded. Watch, bagged. Boots, both present. She picked up the left boot. It was a military-spec tactical boot. The civilian version, not government issue, which meant whoever Reyes worked for was careful about operational security even in off-mission contexts. The heel was solid-looking. She pressed her thumb along the seam at the base of the heel and felt, under the manufactured rigidity, a very slight give in one quadrant. Not flimsy, not obvious, just a fraction of compression that wasn't present in the corresponding location on the right boot. She put the boot back in the lockbox. "Don't let this out of the room," she told Sandra. "For any reason, from anyone. If someone comes with an administrative override, call me before you open it." She wrote her number on a notepad from Sandra's desk. Sandra took it and looked at it and put it in her pocket. "Is the patient going to be okay?" Sandra said. "Working on it," Mara said. She was back in the stairwell when her phone vibrated. "Garrett." She answered on the second step. "Forsyth's assistant just called the third floor desk," Garrett said. His voice had the quality of someone reporting something they didn't like the sound of. "She said the board chairman needs the personal effects from the intake lockbox for insurance documentation. She said it's a standard administrative process." Mara stopped on the landing. When? She said someone would be up in 15 minutes. That was about 3 minutes ago. 12 minutes. She was already moving back up the stairs the way she'd come down. Because she had not told Sandra specifically what to do about an administrative assistant calling ahead, she had only told her not to open it for someone who showed up with an override. And an administrative assistant calling ahead was a different approach, and Sandra might not map the two together without being told explicitly. She pushed back through the third-floor door and went directly to Sandra's station. Sandra was on the phone. She looked up. She held up one finger, a second, just a second, and said into the phone, "I'll call you back," and hung up. "Forsyth's office?" Mara said. "His assistant. Just now." Sandra's expression had shifted. "I was going to call you." "I know. Don't release anything from that room." Mara paused. "And don't tell them I was up here." Sandra nodded once. Then she said, "Can I ask what's in that boot?" "I genuinely don't know," Mara said. "But someone wants it badly enough to move fast, which means it's worth protecting." She took the stairs back down because the elevator would deposit her in a visible location, and she needed to reappear in the trauma bay looking like she had not just been in a race she couldn't explain. She got back to the ER floor and pushed through the doors and crossed to Reyes's bed, and nobody in the room looked at her the way they would have looked at her if she'd been gone long enough to matter. Priya caught her eye and gave a small shake of her head. "Nothing changed, the drip rate is fine, he's stable," and Mara exhaled in a controlled way and checked the monitor herself and confirmed it. Aldrin was off his phone. He was standing near the door with one of the federal agents, looking at something on a tablet the agent was holding, and his expression was the expression of someone reading something that was confirming what they'd already suspected, which was the worst kind of confirmation because it meant the situation was worse than the working hypothesis. "General," she said, low. He came over. Someone from Forsyth's office just attempted to access the third-floor lockbox where Reyes's intake belongings are being held. They called ahead. Insurance documentation. Aldrin's expression didn't change. "When?" "About 10 minutes ago. I've told the charge nurse not to release anything, but I can't hold that legally. If Forsyth uses an administrative override—" "He won't," Aldrin said. He pulled out his own phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds and consisted mostly of him listening, saying 2 words, and hanging up. "Federal preservation hold on all patient personal effects related to this intake. It's filed." He looked at her. "How did you know to check the lockbox?" "Reyes told me," she said. Aldrin looked at the bed. Reyes's eyes were still closed. "He was conscious enough to tell you that." "He's been conscious enough for a while. He's managing his presentation." Aldrin almost smiled. It was a small thing, a fractional movement, but she caught it. "That sounds like him," he said. She went back to the bed and stood at the rail and looked at Reyes, who was doing a convincing impression of someone who was drifting at the edge of consciousness, but whose jaw was slightly too controlled for it to be entirely genuine. "They went for the lockbox," she said, quiet enough that it wouldn't carry. "I've got it held. Federal preservation order is in." His hand moved on the rail. The fingers pressed once against the metal and released. A small, deliberate gesture that wasn't a reflex. "Acknowledged." "Thank you." She went back to her monitoring. It was in the 47th minute after Aldrin's arrival, when she was writing the updated medication log, and the room had settled into the particular charged quiet of a situation that was pausing before its next phase, that Holt came back through the doors. He looked different, not dramatically, not in any way that a stranger would have flagged, but she had been watching this man for 6 months, and she knew the architecture of his professional confidence. Knew the specific way he carried himself when he was certain versus when he was managing uncertainty. And what she saw now was a man who had been in a room with Donna Fitch and had come out of it with something he didn't have when he went in. He stopped just inside the doors. He looked at the room, at Aldrin, at the federal agents, at the monitor, at Reyes, and then he looked at Mara. He walked toward her. She waited. "I need to speak with you," he said. "I'm monitoring a patient." "Priya can monitor him for 3 minutes." She looked at him. She looked at Priya. She looked at the monitor. 3 minutes, she said. She followed him to the far side of the room, near the equipment wall, far enough from the others that the conversation was private, but not so far that she'd moved outside the range where she could see the monitor if something changed. Holt said quietly, "How long have you known about Forsyth?" She looked at him. What do you mean? Don't, he said, not harshly, tiredly. I'm not trying to catch you in something. I'm asking because something Donna said in that meeting doesn't add up for me, and I'm trying to understand the sequence. What did she say? She said the board had been notified of an incoming federal situation at 6:45 this morning, before the ambulance call came in. He paused. The EMS call to this hospital didn't come in until 7:01. The room didn't change. The monitor beeped. Somewhere in the hallway, someone was moving a cart over the threshold bump between floor sections, and the wheel clattered twice. Mara said, "Who notified the board?" She doesn't know, or she says she doesn't know. The notification came through the general admin channel, no sender ID. She thought about that. She thought about a board chairman arriving with procedural concerns already prepared, arriving fast enough to have been in motion before most of the hospital knew what was happening in Trauma Bay 1. She thought about the word Aldrin had used. Someone had been counting on the protocol. The protocol had been ordered by Holt. She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression of a man who was assembling something he did not want to be true and had gotten far enough in the assembly to see its shape. "You didn't know," she said. "Know what?" "What the CT was going to do to him." His jaw tightened. "Of course I didn't know. I ordered it because it was the standard protocol for his presentation." "I know that," she said. "I know that's why you ordered it." He was quiet for a moment. "Someone was counting on that." "Yes." The word landed between them, and neither of them said anything else for a few seconds. What had happened in that meeting with Donna Fitch, Mara didn't fully know. But something had shifted in Raymond Holt, some load-bearing conviction about the situation he was in, and the shift had brought him here rather than to Aldrin, which was interesting. "What are you going to do?" he said. "My job," she said. "What I've been doing." He looked at the patient. He looked at the monitor. He looked at his hands, briefly, and then he looked back at her. "I'm going to tell the federal investigators everything Donna said in that meeting," he said, including the timing of the board notification. "Okay," she said. "I want you to know that." She didn't know exactly what he needed from her in this moment. Absolution, maybe, or confirmation that the thing he was about to do was the right thing, or simply a witness who understood the weight of it. She wasn't able to give him the first one and wasn't comfortable dispensing the second, but the third one she could manage. "I know," she said. He nodded once and walked back toward the doors. She went back to Reyes. The federal investigative team arrived at 12:47, which was 11 minutes ahead of the 2-hour estimate Aldrin had given, which meant something in the Washington communication had accelerated their timeline. There were 4 of them, 2 agents in the standard dark suits of federal investigators, 1 woman in civilian professional dress who carried a forensic tablet and moved with the specific economy of motion of someone who processed evidence for a living, and a 4th man in military dress uniform who outranked everyone in the room except Aldrin, and who arrived already reading from a document on a phone and didn't look up for approximately 90 seconds after entering, which was either extremely rude or extremely focused, and Mara suspected the latter. The next 40 minutes were procedural in a way that she'd anticipated. Statements taken, the room officially designated a federal evidence location, the personal effects lockbox upstairs formally seized and transferred to federal custody. Garrett gave a statement. Torres gave a statement. Caswell gave a statement that was accurate and thorough and reflected well on him and would not get him in any trouble because he hadn't done anything except be a good physician who was out of his depth in a specific and unusual way. Holt gave a statement that lasted 22 minutes. Mara could not hear it. She was with Reyes and the door was closed, but she could observe the body language of the investigator who came out after and went directly to the 4th man, the one in military dress who had been reading his phone. The investigator spoke briefly and quietly. The man in military dress looked up from his phone for the first time since arriving and looked in the direction of the administrative floor above them. Something had accelerated again. The forensic specialist, her name was Agent Breyer, she'd introduced herself in a sentence, spent 12 minutes in the trauma bay taking photographs, logging the medication records Mara had documented, and at one point asked her, with the precise, neutral tone of someone gathering data, "Can you walk me through your reasoning at each decision point from arrival to current status?" Mara walked her through it, all of it. The smell, the symptom cluster, the CT concern, The controlled substances she'd taken, the sequence of administrations and the reasoning behind each one. She did not editorialize. She did not characterize Holt's initial response or her own emotional state. She described actions and observations in the specific, accountable language that documentation required. Breyer typed while she talked and did not ask her to slow down. At the end, she said, "You logged the unauthorized withdrawals yourself." "Yes." "Before you administered them?" "Yes." Breyer looked at her notes. "Why?" "Because if I was right, the documentation was going to matter. And if I was wrong, I was willing to be held accountable for what I'd decided." Breyer wrote something. She didn't share what it was. She said, "Thank you," and moved on to the next item on her list. Reyes reached a stable GCS of 13 at 1:23 in the afternoon. He opened his eyes with the specific deliberateness of a man deciding to stop maintaining a performance. And when he opened them, he was fully present, tracking the room, reading the positions of the federal personnel, doing the same rapid spatial accounting she did in any new situation, and finding her in under 3 seconds. "How long?" he said. "You've been here about 4 hours. You've been stable for the last 2. "The drive." "Federal custody. Agent Breyer has it." He found Breyer across the room and looked at her with the assessing attention of someone deciding whether to trust a stranger with something that mattered. Breyer, for her part, met his gaze without comment, which was probably the right response. "Aldrin's here," Mara said. "I know. I can hear him." He shifted slightly in the bed, a test, seeing what his body would and wouldn't do. And his face registered something at the movement, a flash of discomfort he controlled in about a second and a half. "You treated both compounds?" "Yes." "Most people wouldn't have recognized the second one." "Most people haven't been where I've been." He looked at her. It was the look she'd seen before, across the first moment of eye contact when he'd surfaced the first time. Not recognition exactly, but the adjacent thing, the look of a brain with enough function returning to register that it was being looked at by someone who knew what they were doing. "Where have you been?" he said. She almost answered. Almost. The question had a pull to it that was partly genuine and partly the particular current that crisis creates between people who've been in the same room with a high-stakes situation. The sense of having shared something that makes normal social distance feel arbitrary. "Not the right time," she said. He accepted that. "The board chairman," he said. "Aldrin's team is on it." "Forsyth has been on the hospital board for 9 years, Reyes said. His voice was still rough, but it had more behind it now. The authority of someone accustomed to briefing rather than being briefed. "The network we've been building the case against. They've got 2 domestic operations, one in the supply chain, one in institutional placement. Hospitals, logistics companies, mid-tier financial institutions. People who look like they belong and have been there long enough that nobody questions them. 9 years is long enough," she said. "Long enough to have access to intake protocols. Long enough to know which attending physicians follow procedure without deviation." He paused. "Long enough to flag a patient coming in and know exactly what would happen to him." She thought about Holt. She thought about the board notification at 6:45, before the ambulance call. She thought about the way the plan had been built to use the hospital's own competence against its patient. "They needed it to look like a medical outcome," she said. "Clean," Reyes said. "No witnesses, no weapon. Just a standard scan on an unidentified patient that nobody expected to survive. Except it didn't work. Except you were here." She didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything useful to say. Aldrin had come to the bedside at some point during the exchange, approaching with the quiet of a man who had been listening, and had decided to let the conversation run rather than interrupt it. He stood at the rail and looked at Reyes with the expression she'd seen earlier, personal beneath the professional, kept managed but present. "You look terrible," Aldrin said. "Thank you, sir," Reyes said. "I feel worse." "Can you be moved?" Reyes looked at Mara. It was a question directed at someone else but offered to her, which she appreciated. "Within the hour," she said. "He needs 1 more medication cycle and then I'd want another BP reading before transfer, but the compounds are neutralized." "We're moving him to Denton Falls Federal Medical Center," Aldrin said. "Secure ward. I want him evaluated by our own team." He looked at Mara. "I need you on that transfer." I don't work here anymore, she said. You work for me, he said. Effective this morning. The paperwork is being processed. She looked at him. You can't just... I can, actually, he said. It's one of the things 4 stars gets you. Reyes made a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd had more energy for it. She was preparing the final medication cycle, the last administration before she could clear transfer. When the 3rd floor called the trauma bay directly, she heard Garrett answer it, heard the change in his voice, and looked up. He crossed the room to her with the phone still in his hand, his expression doing the thing where he was controlling what it showed. Sandra from 3rd floor, he said quietly. Someone tried to access the lockbox about 20 minutes ago. Before the federal hold was filed, they got the door open. Mara felt something cold move through her. The boot, she said, still there. Sandra had moved it. He paused. She moved it before anyone got there. Put it in her own locker. Mara exhaled. Smart woman. She says the person who came up wasn't from Forsyth's office. He looked at his phone. She says it was someone she didn't recognize, a man, didn't show ID, knew the administrative override code. The override code that Donna Fitch had used twice last year. Is the boot still secured? Sandra has it. She's asking what to do. Tell her to sit on it until Agent Breyer gets up there. Don't move, don't open, don't tell anyone else. She was already moving toward Breyer. And Garrett? Yeah? Tell her she did exactly the right thing. She got to Breyer in 8 steps and told her what she'd just heard. Breyer's expression didn't change. It was the trained stillness of someone for whom new information was data rather than event. But she was already reaching for her phone before Mara had finished the sentence. Who else knew the administrative override code? Breyer said. Hospital legal counsel used it. Donna Fitch. Breyer was on the phone and moving toward the door simultaneously, and Mara stepped out of the way because the thing that was set in motion now was the investigation's business, not hers. She went back to Reyes and administered the final medication cycle and started the clock on the last pre-transfer observation window. And she was 40 minutes into that window, and the numbers were good, and she was making the notes that would transfer to the federal medical team when the trauma bay doors opened and 2 federal agents came through fast, not running, but with the decisive pace of people responding to something that had just changed. One of them went directly to Aldrin. The other stopped 3 feet from Mara and said, "We need to secure this room." "It's already secure," she said. "Additional security." "Ma'am, I need you to step back from the patient. I'm his treating clinician." "I understand that. I still need you to step back." She looked past him at Aldrin, who was listening to his agent with an expression that had gone very still in the way faces went still when something bad had just become specific rather than theoretical. He looked at her. He said across the room, "They found something in Forsyth's office." "The blue file," she said. His eyes moved to her face. The question in them was clear. "I was told to look for it," she said. "I didn't." "Who told you?" She thought about the text. The unknown number, 5 words sent to a phone that wasn't supposed to know her number, from a contact who clearly had information about what was in this building and what was moving inside it. She thought about what it meant that she hadn't acted on it, had decided the right move was to stay with her patient rather than go rooting through a board chairman's office on the instruction of an anonymous text. She thought about what it meant that someone else had found it anyway. "Someone who knew more about this situation than they told me," she said. Aldrin held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he looked at his agent and said something quiet, and the agent moved toward the doors, and outside the room, something was beginning to accelerate at a rate that the next hour was not going to be able to contain. "What was in the file?" she said. Aldrin looked at Reyes. Reyes was watching the ceiling, listening, his jaw set with the particular tension of someone processing information they'd suspected and are now being told is confirmed. "Bank records," Aldrin said, "transfer documentation, and a communication log." He paused. "Between Forsyth and the man who dosed Major Reyes." "Major. He'd used the rank. She registered that." "Forsyth commissioned it," she said. "Appears so." "How long is he—" "Long enough," Aldrin said. He looked at her. "I need you to finish your transfer prep. We need to move Reyes in the next 15 minutes. I said 40. The situation has changed. Can you do 15? She looked at the monitor. She looked at Reyes. She ran the calculation. The medication was administered, the compounds were neutralized. The primary risk now was physical stability during transport, which was manageable with the right equipment and the right monitoring. 14, she said. Give me 14 and I can sign off on transfer. She turned back to the medication stand and started the transfer documentation, and tried not to think about the fact that somewhere in this building, between the administrative floor and the ER and the third-floor lockbox and the federal agents now moving through the corridors, a net was closing around something she could feel but not yet fully see. 14 minutes. She had started the paperwork and was 7 minutes into it when Priya appeared at her shoulder and said, in a voice that was professionally controlled but carried something sharp underneath, "Mara, the man from the lockbox." She looked up. "Sandra sent a photo," Priya said. She held out her phone. Mara looked at the image. Security camera still, grainy, timestamp from 40 minutes ago. A man in the corridor outside the third-floor lockbox room, facing slightly away from the camera. Middle-aged, medium build, unremarkable. The kind of face that was built for being in institutional spaces without being remembered. Except she remembered it. She had seen it twice in the last 4 hours. Once crossing the lobby when Aldrin's helicopter had landed and the building had been briefly full of personnel she hadn't known to track, and once at the edge of her vision in the ER corridor when she'd been running back from the stairwell. He had been inside the hospital the whole time, which meant the person who'd sent the anonymous text, the person who told her about the blue file, the person who had some level of knowledge about what was inside this institution and how it was organized, had not been watching from outside, was in here, was possibly watching her right now. She looked at the image for 3 more seconds and handed the phone back to Priya. "Give that to Agent Breyer," she said. "Right now." She turned back to her transfer documentation, and her hands were moving with the same steady pace they always moved, because steady hands were not a choice she made consciously. They were just the default her body ran in situations like this, and she was grateful for it in the same practical way she was grateful for a reliable piece of equipment. But her mind was somewhere else. Somewhere in this building was a man who had been here before the helicopter, before the federal team, before any of it. A man who had been in here since the beginning, and she did not know yet whose side he was on. She turned back to her transfer documentation, and her hands kept moving and her mind kept working, because those were 2 separate systems, and she had learned a long time ago to run them in parallel. The man in the security photo was a problem she could not solve from this room. What she could do from this room was finish the transfer paperwork accurately and completely, because Reyes needed to move and her job right now was to make that happen without error. She filed the thought about the unknown man in the same internal space where she'd filed everything else that required action, but not immediate action, and she worked. Breyer came back through the doors 6 minutes later with the focused expression of someone who had just received information that reorganized their picture of the situation. She went directly to Aldrin. They spoke for approximately 90 seconds, and Mara watched from her peripheral vision without appearing to watch. An old skill, the kind you didn't unlearn, and saw Aldrin's expression do the thing it had done when the agent had come in fast from the corridor. The going still that meant something theoretical had just become specific. He looked at Mara. She finished the notation she was writing and looked back. He came over. "The man in the photo," he said, quiet and direct. "We have an ID. Who is he?" "His name is Garrett Solon. He's a private contractor, domestic operations, and he's been flagged in 2 prior federal investigations, neither of which resulted in charges because both times he was gone before anyone could place him at a confirmed location." A pause. "He's not connected to Forsyth." She felt that land. Then who is he connected to? That's the question. Aldrin looked at the doors. He's connected to the network Reyes was building a case against, but not through Forsyth, through a separate channel. A second operative inside the hospital. Possibly, or someone who was sent here specifically because they knew the Forsyth channel had been compromised. She thought about that. She thought about the text message, the unknown number, the 5 words, the information about the blue file. Information that had been accurate, had been actionable, had in fact contributed to what the federal team had found in Forsyth's office. "Aldrin," she said, "the text I got, the one that told me about the file. We're tracing the number. I deleted the message. We have the metadata." He said it without judgment. "We would have preferred the message, but the metadata is enough." She didn't apologize for deleting it, because she'd had a reasonable basis for the decision at the time, and apologizing for reasonable decisions was not a productive habit. If Solon sent it, then he was working against Forsyth from inside, Aldrin said, which could mean a network that's fragmenting, could mean someone running a counter-operation we don't know about, could mean a freelancer playing multiple sides. He looked at her. Could mean something else entirely. You don't know. Not yet. She processed that. The situation had a shape she could partially see and partially couldn't. The part she could see was Forsyth, the planned assassination, the hospital as instrument, the CT scan as weapon. That part was documented, in federal custody, being built into a case that would hold. The part she couldn't see was everything behind it. The network Reyes had been building toward, the 26 months of work on the drive that was now in Breyer's custody, and the man who had been inside this building since before anyone understood what was happening here. "Where's Solon now?" she said. "We don't know." She finished the transfer documentation at the 13-minute mark. 1 minute ahead of what she'd told Aldrin, which was not satisfaction. It was just the natural result of not wasting motion. "He's ready to move," she said. The transfer took 11 minutes to execute and went smoothly in the way that things went smoothly when you had federal personnel and adequate equipment and a patient who was stable enough to cooperate, which Reyes was. He was moved to a transport gurney with the careful economy of a team that had done this before, IV lines managed. Monitoring continued, and Mara walked beside him through the corridor and out the ambulance bay doors into the pale afternoon light of a Denton Falls October. The helicopter was still on the ground in the parking lot, though the perimeter had expanded. 3 government vehicles had joined the 2 that had arrived with the initial team, and there were personnel she hadn't seen before positioned at intervals that said the security footprint had grown in response to whatever Breyer had found in Forsyth's office. Reyes looked at the sky as they came through the doors. He didn't say anything, but she saw the thing cross his face, that open sky, produced in people who had been in enclosed, controlled spaces through a crisis. Something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. The specific exhale of still alive, still outside. "Cold," he said. "October," she said. "Yeah." He looked at her. "You're coming?" "Aldrin asked me to." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He had an IV in each arm, a BP cuff on his left wrist, and a cardiac monitoring lead running under his shirt. And he was watching her with the particular directness of someone who'd been flat on their back for 4 hours and had apparently decided that entitled them to ask direct questions. "Yes," she said. "I'm coming." He looked at the sky again. She moved with the gurney toward the helicopter and did not examine why she'd answered the way she had, because examination required time she didn't currently have. The flight to Denton Falls Federal Medical Center took 19 minutes. She spent all 19 monitoring Reyes, adjusting the drip rate twice in response to BP fluctuations that were expected given transport conditions but needed managing, and saying very little. Reyes said very little too, which she respected. He was a man who understood that not every silence needed to be filled. At one point, over the city, he said, "Voss." She looked at him. "Whatever they told you about your employment status," he said, "make them put it in writing." She almost smiled. "Good advice." "I've dealt with Aldrin for 4 years," he said. "He's honorable. He's also busy. Things fall through the cracks when he's busy." A pause. "Get it in writing." "Noted." He closed his eyes. She went back to his vitals. The Federal Medical Center was 48 minutes of procedural handoff, her documentation reviewed, her clinical notes transferred, a very brief examination from the federal team physician that confirmed her treatment had been correct and her transfer timing had been appropriate. The physician, a compact woman named Dr. Adler, who had the manner of someone with military medical experience she'd stopped advertising, looked at Mara's medication log with an expression that moved from professional assessment to something slightly warmer over the course of about 90 seconds. "Where did you train?" Adler said. "Mercy North, 3 years. "Before that?" Mara looked at her. "Elsewhere." Adler held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the log. "The dual compound protocol you ran is not in any civilian reference I'm aware of." "No," Mara said. "It's not." Adler didn't push it. She made a note on her own documentation and moved on, which told Mara that Adler probably had a security clearance that gave her some context for how questions like that got answered, or didn't. Reyes was moved to a secure room on the third floor. She was not permitted past the floor access point, which was expected. Her federal employment paperwork, as Reyes had predicted, was still in process, and without confirmed clearance she went where civilians went, which was the family waiting area at the end of the corridor, a room with 4 chairs and a window that looked out onto a service road and a parking structure. She sat in one of the chairs. She put her hands in her lap. She breathed out once, slowly. It was the first time since 6:42 that morning that she had stopped moving. Her body didn't know what to do with it. Her mind was still running, still tracking the variables, still holding the open threads. Solon in the building, the network behind Forsyth, the blue file contents she hadn't been fully briefed on, the drive in Breyer's custody, and the chair underneath her felt slightly unreal, the way stillness felt unreal when your system had been in motion long enough that rest registered as malfunction. She stayed anyway. She was good at staying when staying was what the situation required. She was in the chair for 22 minutes when Aldrin came in. He sat down in the chair across from her without preamble, which she appreciated. He looked like a man who had been awake since approximately 4 in the morning, which she suspected was accurate. "The file," she said. "Bank records spanning 14 months," he said. 11 transfers to a holding company that traces back to the network's domestic finance arm. Communication logs. 9 exchanges between Forsyth and an intermediary. The last one was sent at 6:17 this morning. 6:17. 28 minutes before the board notification that had gone to Donna Fitch. "What did it say?" she said. It confirmed the patient's arrival time at Harlow General and the name of the attending on shift. He paused. Holt's name, specifically, as the attending who would follow standard protocol without deviation. The coldness of it settled over her. Not surprised. She had assembled enough of the picture to know it was coming, but the specific weight of hearing it confirmed. Holt hadn't been in on it. He'd been selected for it. His professionalism had been weaponized. "He's going to need to know that," she said. "He already does. The investigative team briefed him an hour ago." She thought about Holt standing in the trauma bay with his arms at a slight defensive angle, and the conversation near the equipment wall, and the way he'd said, "I want you to know that," about his intention to tell the investigators everything. She thought about what it meant to be a meticulous, competent person who had been deliberately chosen because of your competence, because the thing you did reliably had been built into a plan to kill someone. "Is he okay?" she said. Aldrin looked at her. The question had visibly surprised him. "He's cooperating fully. He's shaken." "That's not what I asked." A brief pause. "No," Aldrin said. "I don't think he is." She nodded. There was nothing she could do about that right now. She filed it. "Forsyth," she said, "in federal custody as of 43 minutes ago. His attorney was at the building before we finished processing the paperwork, which tells you something about how prepared they were for this possibility." Aldrin's voice was dry. "It also tells us the attorney was likely retained some time ago, which is an interesting data point for the investigation." "What are the charges?" "Conspiracy to commit a murder of a federal officer, wire fraud, material support to a designated foreign network." He looked at his hands briefly. "The conspiracy charge alone carries life. With the communication log we have, they won't be negotiating it down." She let that land. She had known it was coming. Had known since the moment she'd heard Forsyth's name from a dying man's mouth. But there was still something that shifted in the air when the formal weight of a thing was named. "And the network?" she said. "The drive Reyes was carrying has enough to initiate federal action against 4 additional domestic operatives. The field offices are moving on 2 of them tonight." He looked at her. "The other 2 are going to require more time." "Solon." "Solon is one of the 2, he said. "We believe he was sent in ahead of the primary operation, a contingency. If Forsyth's channel failed, Solon was the backup. But something shifted. He didn't complete his assignment. He tipped me off instead." "It appears so." Aldrin leaned back slightly. "Which means either he's been turned and is working a counter-operation, or his operational calculus changed when Forsyth's plan started to fail, and he made a judgment call about which side of this was going to hold." A pause. "Neither option is clean." "No," she said. "But the file got found." The file got found, he agreed him, and Reyes is alive. He looked at her. Both of those things because of decisions you made today. She didn't respond to that directly because the statement had a kind of weight to it that she didn't know how to receive gracefully and had never learned to, and she suspected Aldrin knew that about her already. The employment paperwork, she said instead. He had the good grace to look slightly caught. It's being processed. Reyes told me to get it in writing. Aldrin looked toward the window. Reyes is not wrong, he said, with the tone of a man who had heard that particular piece of advice applied to him before and was not entirely able to argue against it. He reached into his interior jacket pocket and produced a folded document, which is why I had it drawn up on the flight here. She took it. She unfolded it. She read it. Not quickly, not as a formality, but actually read it, because that was what you did with documents that mattered. It was a federal contractor appointment. Her name, her qualifications, which were listed with a specificity that said someone had accessed a file she hadn't put together herself. Her assignment to a rapid response medical consultation unit under the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Effective date? Today's date. Signed by Aldrin and countersigned by someone whose name she recognized from Defense Department briefings she had no official reason to have attended. This is not a nursing contract, she said. No, Aldrin said. It's not. She looked at him. We've known where you were for 2 years, he said. We were waiting to see if you'd stay in civilian practice or find your way back. A pause. Today clarified the question. She folded the document and put it in her pocket. She didn't have an immediate response to the idea that she had been watched for 2 years and had not known it, because the response she wanted to give, which involved several pointed observations about consent and institutional surveillance, was not the most productive use of the current moment. We'll talk about the 2 years, she said. Yes, he said. We will. She looked at the window. The service road outside was unremarkable. A delivery truck was maneuvering toward a loading dock with the patient grinding effort of a large vehicle in a small space. Normal. Entirely normal, in the way that the world outside institutions always was, continuing its business at whatever tempo it had always moved while the interior of the institution reorganized itself around a crisis. She had been awake since 5:30. She had not eaten since 6:15, a protein bar from her locker, half of which she'd put back for later and had not returned to. She had administered treatment for 2 sequenced military-grade neurotoxins, held a federal evidence lockbox against institutional interference, run the floors of a hospital in which she had been terminated, and apparently been under some form of government observation for 24 months. She was tired in the bone-deep, specific way that her particular body got tired in the aftermath of operational intensity. Not the ordinary fatigue of a long shift, but the toll of sustained high-alert function, which ran on different fuel and depleted different reserves. She was also, she recognized, not done. What do you need from me tonight? She said. Nothing tonight, Aldrin said. Tonight you rest. The federal team handles Forsyth's processing and the initial network actions. He stood. Tomorrow I need you briefed on the unit you're joining, and I need your clinical notes formalized into a federal case record. Okay. He moved toward the door. He stopped. Mara, he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name since she'd seen him in the trauma bay, and the shift from Medic Voss or simply Voss had a weight to it that she registered. What you did today? Recognizing the compound, holding the protocol, staying with him. I've run a lot of operations. I know what good looks like, and I know what exceptional looks like. He paused. You know which one today was? She looked at him. Get some sleep, he said, and left. She sat in the chair for another 4 minutes because the room had finally gone quiet, and her body had registered it, and she was allowing that for exactly 4 minutes before she would need to be moving again, because there were things that still required resolution, and she was not the kind of person who left resolution to someone else if she could help it. She was on minute 3 when her phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at it. She thought about the last time that had happened, in the corridor of Harlow General, with the rotors vibrating the glass and the sequence of everything that had followed. She answered. Ms. Voss. Male voice. Not the same voice as earlier. Not the flat command register of a professional briefing, but something lower, rougher, with a tension underneath it that the professional control couldn't entirely suppress. I think we should talk. Solon, she said. A pause. Short. The pause of someone recalibrating after not expecting to be named. "You're quick," he said. "Tell me something I don't know." She kept her voice even. "You sent the text." "I sent the text." "You were inside the building before the helicopter landed." "Before the ambulance arrived," he said, which was a correction that told her something about when he'd known and what he'd been positioned to do. "I've been in Denton Falls for 9 days." "And you were sent to do what exactly?" The pause this time was longer. Not evasion, consideration. The pause of someone deciding how much to give. "I was sent to make sure the operation succeeded," he said. "Forsyth's channel, the scan, the outcome." He said it without inflection, the way trained people described operational objectives before they became personal. And then something shifted. What shifted? "I watched you walk into that ambulance bay," he said. "I was in the parking structure. I had a line of sight to the ambulance, and I watched you smell the air around him before they'd finished unloading the gurney, and I watched your face when you recognized it, and I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought someone was going to do their job right for once." She let that sit for a moment. "So you sent me the text." "I sent you the text, and I put the communication in Forsyth's office in a location where the federal team would find it." "You put it there." "The blue file was already there," he said. "I just made sure it stayed where it was and that the right people were directed to it." She thought about that. She thought about a man who had been in the building since before the ambulance arrived, who had been positioned to ensure a plan succeeded and had instead positioned to ensure it failed. The calculation was not clean he'd said so himself by implication, and she was not interested in making it clean because the world was not a clean place, and people made decisions in the middle of situations that the decisions themselves then changed. "Why are you calling me?" she said. "Because Aldrin's team is going to find me," he said, "within the next 12 to 18 hours. I've run that calculation, and the result is consistent." Another pause. "And when they do, they're going to ask me about my operational history with the network. And there are 2 things in that history that I need someone outside the federal structure to know before it becomes classified and disappears into a case file." "What 2 things?" "The first is that there are 3 individuals inside the domestic operation who have not been identified in Reyes's intelligence. They're in the supply chain tier, not the institutional tier. The drive won't have them." He gave her 3 names, steady and clear, with the precision of someone who had been holding them and waiting to put them somewhere they would matter. "Write those down." She didn't have paper. She typed them into her phone, one at a time, reading them back to confirm. "The second thing," he said. She waited. "There's a physician," he said, "at Harlow General, not Holt, not anyone who was in that trauma bay today." A pause in which she could hear something shift in his breathing. Not fear, but the specific tension of something a person has been carrying and is finally setting down. She's been in the network for 4 years. She's the one who identified Reyes when the EMS call came in. She's the one who flagged Holt as the right attending to order the scan. "Name," Mara said. He said it. She recognized it. The recognition hit her low in the chest, not because she knew this physician well, but because she knew her enough. Had worked alongside her 3 times in 6 months, had found her competent and professional, and had never had cause to look at her the way she was looking at everything right now, with the specific quality of attention that asked what is actually here rather than what does this appear to be. "Are you certain?" she said. "I watched the communication," he said. She sent the alert at 6:51, 10 minutes before Reyes was brought in. 6:51, which was after the EMS call but before the ambulance arrived. Enough time to identify the patient. How? From the EMS report, from a description, from something about the Route 9 location that meant something to someone who knew where Reyes was operating, and to send a message to whoever was waiting. And whoever was waiting had been Forsyth. "This goes to Aldrin," she said. "Of course it does," Solon said. "That's why I'm telling you, because you're going to tell him, and it's going to be in the record before I'm in federal custody, and everything I say is filtered through attorneys and classification levels and the question of what I get in exchange." Another pause. "When I go in, I'd like someone to be able to confirm that I gave this to you before any negotiations started." She understood. He was protecting the value of the information by establishing its provenance through a third party who had no stake in the deal. "Boss," he said, "for what it's worth." She waited. You did good today, he said. In there. With him. The professional register had softened slightly, not into warmth exactly, but into something more human than the operational tone he'd been using. I've seen a lot of people in high-pressure situations make decisions. Most of them freeze or overcorrect. You just worked. She didn't know what to do with that either, which was becoming a theme. Turn yourself in, she said. I know. Tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight while the Forsyth processing is still active and the case momentum is in the right direction. She paused. Aldrin is honorable. Tell him everything you told me. I intend to. And Solon. Yeah. Don't run the calculation on whether the information buys you enough. Just give them everything. A pause. It matters more than what you get for it. He was quiet for a moment, then, yeah. The call ended. She sat with the phone in her hand and the list of 3 names on her screen and the physician's name, the 4th name, the one she hadn't written down because it was already carved into a different part of her mind. And she sat with the weight of the day as it had fully assembled itself in the quiet of this waiting room. She called Aldrin. He picked up on the second ring. Solon just called me, she said. A beat. Where is he? I don't know. He says he's going to turn himself in tonight. She paused. He gave me information you need. 3 names in the supply chain tier that won't be on Reyes's drive. She read them off. She heard him writing. And a name at Harlow General, a physician. She gave him the name. He says she flagged Reyes's identity from the EMS report and sent the alert to Forsyth at 6:51. The silence on Aldrin's end lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was long enough to confirm that he was taking this as seriously as it warranted. Send me the 3 names in a text, he said. Already typing. The physician. We'll need to move on her tonight before she has reason to run. A pause. How reliable is Solon's information? I think very, she said. He's positioning himself ahead of federal custody. He gave this to me to establish provenance before negotiation. Smart, Aldrin said. Not approvingly, not disapprovingly, just factually. He was inside the building before the ambulance arrived, she said. He was positioned to ensure the operation succeeded. He changed his mind when he saw how I responded to the patient at the ambulance bay. Another silence. That's an unusual pivot. It's a human one, she said. People change their minds when something surprises them. A sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement, but occupied the space between them. Get some sleep, Voss. This is going to be a long few days. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the window. The delivery truck had finished maneuvering and the service road was empty, just the pale concrete of it and the October light going flat as evening came in. She thought about the physician at Harlow General. She had worked alongside her 3 times, had found her competent, had never had cause. And that was the thing, the specific thing that kept landing differently each time she turned it over, had never had cause because the cause had been there the whole time and she hadn't looked. She had spent 6 months in that hospital being invisible. She had not considered that other people might be invisible in the same way. She had been too busy being underestimated to wonder who else was hiding in plain sight. The thought sat in her chest with a weight she didn't try to resolve, because some things weren't resolved so much as integrated, carried forward, added to the accumulated understanding of how institutions worked, and how people worked inside them, and what it cost when the wrong people used both to their advantage. Her phone vibrated, a text from Garrett. We heard about the arrest. You okay? She looked at it. She thought about Garrett, who had called the 3rd-floor charge nurse when she asked without knowing why, who had taken the photo from Priya and gotten it to Breyer without being told it mattered, who had been doing his job in a building that turned out to have been partly occupied by people doing something else entirely. She typed back, Yes. How's the floor? A pause. Then, quiet. Holt went home, but so they closed Trauma Bay 1. Everyone's just processing, I think. Then after a moment, Sandra says hi. She wants you to know she moved the boot to her bottom drawer specifically because of the way Forsyth's assistant said insurance documentation. She said it was too smooth. Mara looked at that for a long moment. Good instincts, she thought. Sandra had good instincts and had trusted them without needing permission to do so, which was the thing that mattered. She was typing a response when a sound reached her from the corridor outside the waiting room. Not running, but the fast, deliberate pace of multiple people moving with purpose, and the specific rhythm of personnel who were converging on a location with intent. She was on her feet before she'd made a conscious decision to stand. She went to the waiting room door and opened it and looked into the corridor. 3 federal agents were moving toward the elevator bay at the end of the hall. Breyer was with them, on her phone, and her expression was the one she wore when information had arrived that reorganized the operational picture. One of the agents had a hand on his weapon, not drawn, not raised, but positioned, the specific posture of someone who had been told to expect resistance. Behind them, walking with the slightly too controlled pace of someone managing their own urgency, was a woman in a white coat. Mara recognized her. The physician Solin had named. She was walking with the federal agents, not in custody, not yet. Nothing had been formalized in the hallway, but she was walking the way people walked when options were closing around them and they hadn't yet decided whether to accept that or to act against it. Her eyes moved down the corridor. They found Mara. Something crossed the physician's face. Recognition first, then a rapid recalculation. The same expression Mara had seen on people who understood in a single moment that the shape of their situation had just changed, and that the person they were looking at was the reason. She stopped walking. The federal agents moved 2 more steps before registering that she'd stopped. Breyer looked up from her phone. The physician looked at Mara for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said very quietly something that Mara was too far away to hear. And then she ran. She ran, and Mara was already moving. Not after her. That wasn't the calculation. The federal agents were already responding. Breyer was on the radio. The building had security personnel on every floor and exits that were controlled. What Mara was calculating in the first 2 seconds was the layout she had absorbed when she came in, the way she absorbed all layouts, and the specific geometry of this corridor relative to the elevator bay, the stairwell exits, and the fire door at the far end of the hall that the physician had just turned toward. The fire door opened onto a stairwell that went down to the parking level. The parking level had a vehicle exit and a pedestrian gate. The pedestrian gate was 40 meters from the emergency vehicle bay, where 2 federal transport units were currently parked, and where there should have been. She ran the personnel count from when they'd arrived. At least 1 agent on exterior security. Should have been. She went for the stairwell. She hit the fire door 6 seconds behind the physician and took the stairs fast, not reckless, 3 floors to the parking level, listening to the descent ahead of her. Footsteps, the particular rhythm of someone in a white coat and clinical shoes who was not trained for this and knew it, moving fast but not efficiently, taking the steps at a rate that prioritized speed over control. Mara took them at a rate that prioritized both. She came through the parking level door with enough momentum to scan the space before she'd fully stopped moving. Concrete, low light, 2 rows of vehicles, the vehicle exit gate ahead and to the left, the pedestrian gate ahead and right, and Dr. Nora Veldin in a white coat approximately 30 meters away, running toward the pedestrian gate with the specific urgency of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it. "Veldin," Mara said. She didn't shout it. The concrete carried sound efficiently, and she didn't need volume. Veldin didn't stop. She hit the pedestrian gate and pushed it. It swung outward, no lock, and she was through. Mara crossed the parking level in 11 seconds and came through the gate into the exterior service area behind the medical center, a narrow corridor of asphalt between the building's rear face and a chain-link perimeter fence, maybe 4 meters wide, service vehicles along one side. The emergency vehicle bay visible around the corner to her left. Veldin was at the perimeter fence, both hands on the chain link, looking at it with the rapid assessment of someone calculating whether they could climb it, and already registering that the answer was no in the time she had. Mara stopped 12 feet from her. She was breathing harder than she would have liked. Her body was running on a deficit that the adrenaline was covering and would eventually present the bill for. She noted that and put it aside. Veldin turned around. She was 50 years old, lean and sharp-featured, a hospitalist physician with 19 years of practice at Harlow General before she'd transferred to this side of Denton Falls 3 years ago. Mara had encountered her on the floor 3 times in 6 months, once during a complex cardiac case, once in a hallway consult about a medication interaction. Once in the break room where they'd been the only two people present for about 4 minutes and had exchanged the polite, minimal conversation of two people who didn't know each other and had nothing in particular to establish. She had seemed competent, careful, professional. She had been all of those things, just not in the direction anyone had assumed. "Don't come any closer," Veldin said. Her voice was controlled in the way that voices were controlled when the person behind them was managing something that wanted to be much louder. "I'm not going to," Mara said. "I don't need to." Veldin looked at the fence. She looked at the corner around which the federal agents would appear in approximately 30 seconds. She looked at Mara. "You don't understand what this is," Veldin said. "I understand more than you know," Mara said. "And you know I do, which is why you ran when you saw me." Something crossed Veldin's face, complicated, fast, the expression of someone whose internal accounting was being forced into a reckoning. "You're 23 years old," she said. "You're a floor nurse." "Yes," Mara said. "And you identified a patient from an EMS description, sent an alert to a network operative at 6:51 this morning, and then showed up to work and put in a full shift while federal agents processed the crime in your hospital. So let's not do the part where we decide who we are based on what we look like." Veldin went still. The federal agents came around the corner. 3 of them, Breyer behind, and they slowed when they saw the scene. Veldin against the fence, Mara 12 feet away, neither of them moving, and held their approach, reading the geometry of it. Breyer looked at Mara. Mara gave a small shake of her head. "Not yet. Let her land." Veldin was looking at the ground between them. Her hands had dropped from the fence. Her posture had changed. The flight energy had gone out of it, replaced by something more collapsed, more interior. The body language of someone arriving at the end of a calculation and not liking the result. "How long?" Mara said. Veldin looked up. 4 years. "What did they give you?" A pause. "Protection," she said. "For my son. He was involved with them before I was. He was young. He made choices." She stopped. "They said if I cooperated, they'd make his exposure disappear. If I didn't, they'd bury him with it," Mara said. "Yes." Mara looked at her. She believed it. She believed it because it was the kind of leverage that worked on people who had something to protect. And because the expression on Veldin's face right now was not the expression of someone who had chosen this as a primary preference, but of someone who had been in a corner long enough that the corner had become the whole room. That did not cancel what she had done. The distinction between compelled and chosen was real, and it mattered for what came next, legally and otherwise. But it did not cancel the morning, or Reyes on the gurney, or the CT scan that had been 40 minutes from killing a man whose intelligence might save people Veldin would never meet. She had made her choices. The weight of them was hers. "Turn yourself in," Mara said. "Right now. Tell them everything about the sun. Tell them the leverage." She paused. "There's more case to be made against the network with your full cooperation than there is against you alone. You know that. They know that." Veldin looked at the agents. She looked at Breyer. She looked at Mara. "They'll still charge me," she said. "Yes," Mara said. "They will." "My career is over," Mara said, not harshly. "I know that. You know that. But there's a version of what comes next where your son has a chance, and a version where he doesn't, and right now you're still standing at the point where that decision gets made." Veldin closed her eyes. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she walked toward Breyer with her hands slightly raised and said, "I want to make a statement." Breyer took it from there. Mara leaned against the chain-link fence and breathed out once, fully, down to the bottom of it, and let her body remember what stillness felt like. Garrett Solon turned himself in to the Denton Falls Federal Field Office at 9:47 that night. Mara knew this because Aldrin called her at 10:03 to confirm it, and to tell her that Solon's preliminary statement had corroborated everything he'd told her on the phone and had added 17 additional data points that the investigative team was already working through. "He knew a lot," Aldrin said. "He'd been in position for 9 days, she said. 9 days is a long time to watch a building." He said something else. A pause. "He said to tell you he's taking the advice about just giving them everything." She was sitting on the edge of a bed in a federal facility guest room that was more comfortable than she'd expected, and less comfortable than she needed, And she was still wearing the same scrubs she'd put on at 6:42 that morning, and she had eaten a sandwich from a vending machine 2 hours ago that had not been adequate but had been present. Good, she said. She slept 5.5 hours. Not well. Her body was still running the depletion patterns of sustained high alert function, and sleep in that state was lighter than it should have been, interrupted twice by the specific jolt of a nervous system that hadn't fully believed the operational phase was over. But 5.5 hours was more than she usually got after a day like the one she'd had, and she woke at 5:44 with her mind already moving. The next 3 days were procedural in a way that required its own kind of endurance. She gave 4 formal statements to federal investigators across 2 days. She signed her name to clinical documentation that was then classified at a level that meant she would not be able to discuss the specifics with anyone who didn't have corresponding clearance. She sat through a debriefing session with the military medical unit she'd been contracted to join, during which she answered 12 questions about the dual compound treatment protocol, 2 questions about how she'd identified the odor, and 1 question about her prior service history that she answered in 4 words: "You have the file." And that was the end of that particular line of inquiry. She went back to Harlow General on the morning of the 3rd day, not because she was required to, because there were things that needed to be finished there, and she was the kind of person who finished things. The hospital looked the same from the outside. The glass and concrete face of it, the ambulance bay, the parking structure to the east. But inside there was a different quality to the air, the specific atmosphere of an institution that has been through something and is in the early disoriented stage of processing it. Personnel moved with slightly more care than usual. Conversations at the nursing stations were quieter. The trauma bay had been released from federal designation the previous morning and was functioning again, but the echo of what had happened in it was still present in the way that people avoided looking directly at Bay 1 for a fraction of a second longer than was natural. Garrett saw her from across the floor and came over immediately, his expression moving through 3 things in about 2 seconds: relief, uncertainty about how to greet her, and then the decision to just be direct about it. "You're back," he said. Briefly, she looked around the floor. "How is it?" "Weird," he said. "Honestly. Everyone knows most of what happened, but not all of it, and the parts they don't know, they're filling in with whatever makes sense to them." He paused. "Holt's been out since yesterday. HR sent an email that said he was on administrative leave pending the investigation, which everyone read about 6 different ways." "He's cooperating," she said, "for what it's worth." "I figured." Garrett looked at her carefully. "Are you coming back? On the floor?" "No," she said. "I've got a new position." He looked at her. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone who had the broad outline of what that meant, without the specifics, and had decided the specifics weren't his to ask for. "That appointment your friend called about," he said. "The unknown number." "Something like that." "Okay." He looked at his tablet, then back at her. "Sandra wants to see you before you go. She's on break in 20 minutes. I'll find her." She walked the floor once before she looked for Sandra. Not because she needed to check anything. The floor was running, the board was moving. There was a new attending on trauma coverage whose name she didn't know and who moved through the space with the slightly stiff efficiency of someone still learning its architecture. She walked it because she had spent 6 months on this floor, and some part of her wanted to close the loop properly, to walk the space she'd worked in and acknowledge it as the place where this had happened and where she had, in the end, done what she came to do. She had not come to Harlow General planning to break open a federal conspiracy. She had come because it was a transfer opportunity and the parking was cheaper before 7. She had spent 6 months being managed by a man who looked through her and doing her job in the space around that, and she had done it the same way she did everything. Quietly, thoroughly, with the consistent attention that nobody in this building had registered until the day it mattered. She found Sandra in the 3rd-floor break room, a small woman in her mid-40s with sensible shoes and the particular composure of someone who had trusted their instincts in a crisis and been correct about it. Sandra looked at her when she came in and said, "I heard they caught the physician." "Yes." "And the board chairman." "Yes." "And several other people whose names I don't know and probably won't." "Probably not," Mara said. "Not publicly." Sandra poured herself a coffee and poured a second one without asking and set it in front of Mara. It was from the same kind of machine that existed on the ER floor. Serviceable, not good, the honest institutional coffee of a building that ran on function over preference. "You moved the boot," Mara said. "I moved the boot," Sandra said, "the way that woman said insurance documentation." She shook her head. "Too smooth, too ready. When someone has that answer that fast, they practiced it. Good instinct." "I've worked in administration for 14 years, Sandra said. You learn to hear the difference between someone doing their job and someone doing a performance of their job." Mara looked at her coffee. She thought that was one of the most precise descriptions of what she'd been watching all day on the 3rd of October at Harlow General. The difference between people doing their jobs and people performing them. The difference between Garrett filing accurate documentation and Forsyth arriving with a practiced explanation. Between Holt following protocol because he believed in it and Veldin sending an alert because she was afraid. Between being competent and using competence as cover. "Thank you," Mara said, "for what you did." "You're the one who figured it out," Sandra said. "I'm the one who figured out part of it," Mara said. "You held the other part." Sandra considered that. "I suppose that's accurate," she said, in the tone of someone who was not used to their contributions being named and wasn't entirely sure how to receive it. Mara finished her coffee. She said goodbye to Sandra and to Priya, who she found in the corridor and who said quietly and without fanfare, "I hope the new job is good," in the specific way that indicated she had formed a reasonable inference about what the new job was and was choosing not to elaborate on it. She was in the elevator, going down, when her phone rang. "Reyes." She answered. "You're at the hospital," he said, finishing something. "Closing the loop," he said. He said it like he understood exactly what she meant, which she suspected he did. "How are you?" she said. "Better than I was." A pause. "Adler says the compounds are fully cleared. She's impressed with the treatment protocol, by the way. She asked me who you trained under." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know, and that I suspected the answer was classified." He paused. "Was I right?" "Partially," she said. The elevator opened on the ground floor. She walked through the lobby toward the exit, past the administrative corridor with its photographs of board members and founding directors, past the photograph of Dale Forsyth that was still on the wall because someone would need to make a formal decision to remove it, and that decision was in a queue somewhere behind everything else that had to be processed. She looked at the photograph as she passed it. Forsyth at some hospital gala, 10 years younger, hand extended in the gesture of a man receiving something. An award, a handshake, a moment of public recognition. His expression had the ease of someone who had never expected to be caught because the institution around him was too familiar with his face to look at it clearly. She kept walking. "Voss," Reyes said, "still here. Aldrin briefed me this morning. Fully." A pause. "Veldin's son is 17 years old. They've had him for 4 years. She thought about that. 13 years old when it started. The age at which people made choices they didn't have the full equipment to understand the consequences of, and then other people used those choices to own them. "Will they protect him?" she said. Witness protection framework, Reyes said, for both of them. "It depends on how much she gives them, but the early read is that she's giving everything." He paused. "She's been wanting to give everything for a long time, I think. Some people are holding something so heavy that the relief of putting it down outweighs what it costs them." Mara pushed through the hospital's front doors and came out into the morning. It was colder than it had been 3 days ago. The October light was the low, clean light of a season that was settling in rather than passing through, and it hit the parking lot concrete and the ambulance bay and the glass face of Harlow General with an evenness that made everything look clear. "I'm reading Forsyth's formal charges," she said, "when they're public." "Tomorrow morning," Reyes said. "The DA's office files at 9. It's going to be public by 10. "Good. Mara." He said her name the way Aldrin had eventually said her name. First name, the shift that meant the professional architecture had settled enough to let something more direct through. "I want to say something, and I want you to actually hear it." She stopped walking. She was in the parking lot, halfway to the row where she'd parked 3 days ago, in a spot she'd chosen because it was closest to the stairwell and cost less before 7. "Okay," she said. "What you did on the 3rd, he said. "The whole of it. Not just identifying the compound or holding the lockbox or getting Breyer to the file. All of it." a pause in which she could hear him choosing words with a care that didn't come naturally to a man accustomed to briefing rather than processing. You were invisible for 6 months in that building. You showed up early and did thorough work and nobody clocked it. And then when it mattered, when the thing that mattered most was someone doing the right thing at the right moment, you were there and you were ready. And it was because of every single shift you'd put in when no one was watching. She didn't say anything. I've been in a lot of high-pressure situations, he said. I've worked with people who were trained for exactly those moments, and most of them needed the recognition to sustain the work. They needed to know someone was watching. A pause. You didn't. I knew the work was worth doing, she said. That was enough. I know, he said. That's what I'm saying. She stood in the parking lot and held the phone and let the morning be what it was. Cold and clear and unremarkable in the way that mornings were when the crisis had passed and the world had not reorganized itself to acknowledge it, because the world did not do that, had never done that, and the people who waited for it were always disappointed. Get some rest, she said. You too. A pause. I'll see you when you're briefed in. When's that? Aldrin said Monday. It's Thursday, so rest until Monday, he said, and hung up. She stood there for another moment. She thought about 6 months of arriving before 7 to save on parking. 6 months of accurate medication reconciliations that nobody confirmed, of caught irregularities that nobody acknowledged, of shifts done thoroughly in the specific silence of being looked through rather than looked at. 6 months of carrying what she knew and keeping it quiet because the context for it didn't exist in this place, and building the work anyway in the space around that. And she thought about the morning of the 3rd of October, and a man on a gurney, and a smell in the air that she recognized when no one else did, and the particular cost of being the only person in a room who knows what they're looking at. She had not hesitated, not because she wasn't afraid. She had been, in the specific low-frequency way of someone who understands consequences clearly enough to be afraid of getting them wrong, but because hesitation, in the moment she'd been in, would have required her to value her own position more than the outcome, and she did not work that way. She had never worked that way. That was not a virtue she'd chosen so much as a disposition she'd been built into by the accumulated experience of every time she'd been in a situation where the right decision was also the harder one, and had made it, and had lived with whatever it cost, and had been okay. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for 2 minutes. She looked at the front face of Harlow General, the glass doors, the ambulance bay, the sign with the hospital name in blue letters that had been the last thing she'd looked at every morning for 6 months before going in. It was the last time she would look at it like this. From the outside, as a place she worked. The next time she drove past it, it would be a building she had passed through during a specific event, one chapter in a sequence of chapters, and it would carry the weight of what had happened here and also the particular freedom of being behind her. She started the engine. The formal charges against Dale Forsyth were filed at 9:07 on Friday morning and were public by 9:52, which was 8 minutes ahead of Reyes's estimate. Mara read them at a small table in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the Federal Medical Center on her second actual cup of coffee in 3 days, while outside the window Denton Falls moved through its Friday morning with the normal velocity of a city that was not aware it had recently been the site of something that mattered. Conspiracy to commit murder of a federal officer. Wire fraud, material support to a designated foreign network, obstruction of a federal investigation. The charges were specific and documented, and the documentation was extensive: bank records, communications logs, the blue file that Solon had positioned for federal agents to find, and the formal statements of 4 cooperating witnesses whose identities were sealed pending the broader case proceedings. The morning news had Forsyth's name in the headline and a photograph taken at his arrest. Not the gala photograph from the hospital wall, not the polished institutional image of a board chairman in good standing, but the photograph taken in the parking structure of the federal building where he'd been processed. Hands in front of him, the document case gone, the expensive suit rumpled in the specific way of clothes worn through a night of detention. He looked in that photograph exactly like what he was. Not powerful, not controlled, a man whose architecture of certainty had been taken apart piece by piece over the course of a single day, and who was standing now in the structural rubble of it, She read the charges twice, not because she'd missed something the first time, but because she wanted the full weight of them to be real. She had been raised, in the specific discipline of her prior life, to believe that documentation was the most durable form of consequence, that the record of a thing outlasted the people who disputed it, that what was written and filed and entered into the formal accounting of events would be there when everything else had shifted. Forsyth would have attorneys. The case would take time. Nothing in the legal system moved with the speed that justice felt like it should in the acute moment of wanting it. She knew that, but the record was made, the charges were filed, the bank records were in federal custody, and the communications logs were in federal custody, and the testimony of 4 cooperating witnesses was in federal custody, and none of that was going away. She closed the news app. She had a text from Garrett. "It's on the news. You see it?" "Yes," she typed back. "How are you doing?" She thought about that for a moment. How was she doing? The question had a simplicity to it that she didn't immediately know how to satisfy. She was tired. She was clear. She was sitting in a coffee shop on a Friday morning in Denton Falls with a contract in her pocket that was changing the shape of what came next. And the shape of what came next was different from anything she had been moving toward before the 3rd of October. And that was true in ways she hadn't fully mapped yet. She was also, she recognized with some surprise, "Okay." "Okay," she typed. "How's the floor?" "Better today?" he wrote back. Priya brought bagels. Don't know why, but it helped. She smiled at her phone. A small thing, unwitnessed, the kind of smile that was just the genuine response of a person to something that was humanly simple and true. Priya had brought bagels because crises left a deficit in people, and food was one of the oldest ways of acknowledging that. It didn't solve anything. It was also not nothing. "Good," she typed, and meant it. She finished her coffee. She put on her jacket. She was at the door of the coffee shop when Aldrin called. "The Forsyth press conference is at 2, he said, without preamble. "The DA's office is running it. Federal investigators will be present." A pause. "I've been asked if there is personnel involved in the case who should be present for the formal public record." "What did you say?" "I said I would ask." She pushed through the door and came out onto the sidewalk. The morning was cold, clean, the kind of October day that Denton Falls produced when it was trying to be honest about what the season was. People moved past her on the sidewalk, a woman with a stroller, 2 men in the clothes of office workers cutting across toward the transit stop, a teenager with earbuds who was looking at her phone and navigating the sidewalk on peripheral vision alone. Normal. All of it. The city going about its accounting of a Friday. "I'll be there," she said. She was. The press conference was held in the main room of the DA's office building on Calder Street, a formal space that held about 40 journalists and 3 camera crews, and the specific charged atmosphere of a room where something that had been inside an investigation was about to become public record. Mara arrived at 1:45 and stood at the back of the room, in civilian clothes, dark jacket, dark pants, the same flat professional attire that made her look like a number of things she could be, and watched the room arrange itself around the event. Aldrin was at the front, in dress uniform, 4 stars present and visible. Breyer was to his right with a file and the composed attention of someone who had spent 3 days building toward this moment. The DA, a woman named Holloway with sharp features and the practiced public presence of someone who had done this often enough to make it look effortless without it being effortless, stood at the podium and arranged her materials. Forsyth was not in the room. He was in federal detention and would remain there until the bail hearing, at which point the prosecution would argue successfully, Mara was certain of this, that a man with offshore accounts and demonstrated contact with a foreign network was a flight risk, and he would remain detained through the early stages of a trial that was going to last a long time and receive extensive attention. Dr. Nora Veldin was not in the room either. She was in a different kind of arrangement, the sealed testimony process that would take months to fully develop. And her name had not yet been made public because her cooperation had value that needed to be protected. And the people making that determination were better positioned to make it than anyone outside the process. Holloway opened the press conference at 2:03 with a statement that was clear and specific and did not soften the substance of what had happened. She described a hospital board chairman who had used his institutional position over 9 years to facilitate a foreign-connected network operating on domestic soil. She described the attempt on the life of a federal officer. She described the mechanism, the compound, the planned CT scan, the intended outcome, with enough precision to make the calculation clear without compromising operational details that were still relevant to the ongoing case. She described the chain of events that had prevented it. The patient is alive today, Holloway said, because a nurse at Harlow General identified a threat that no standard protocol was designed to catch and refused to stand down when ordered to. The cameras moved, not toward Mara. She was at the back of the room, and she was not a figure anyone would have identified by sight. But the cameras moved in the direction of the statement, toward the space in the press room where the thing that had happened was being named. And what was being named was specific and documented, and now part of the public record that Mara had believed in from the moment she'd signed her name in the controlled substances log with the date and time recorded to the minute. Aldrin spoke after Holloway. He was brief. He described the federal case in terms that were accurate and appropriately general. He acknowledged the investigative team. He acknowledged Breyer. He paused near the end of his statement and said something that Mara had not known he was going to say. I also want to acknowledge a civilian contractor whose clinical judgment and personal courage made every subsequent action in this case possible. Her name is not being made public at her request, and the details of her prior service are classified. What I can say is that she is exactly the kind of person we need in the roles we're asking her to fill, and that the patient who is alive today is alive because she made the right decisions when the wrong ones were easier. Mara stood at the back of the room and listened to that. She did not feel the thing that she might have expected to feel. The vindication, the relief, the satisfying arrival of recognition after 6 months of being invisible. She felt something quieter and more complicated. She felt the specific texture of a thing that was over, not resolved in the sense of having been fixed, because the damage done by people like Forsyth and Veldon was not fixed so much as accounted for, entered into the record and made to bear the weight of its own consequences, but over in the sense of having reached the point where what had happened was what had happened, and it was documented, and the people who needed to answer for it were answering. She had not done what she'd done on the 3rd because she'd known this press conference would happen. She'd done it because the alternative was a man dying on a table and a plan succeeding that should not have succeeded. Recognition, when it came, was not why the work had been worth doing. The work had been worth doing because it was right to do it. That was the thing she'd understood for a long time, and the thing that the morning of the 3rd had clarified in a way that was now permanent. The understanding that institutions would not always see you, that protocol would not always be enough, that competence without visibility was still competence, and that the decision to do the right thing in the moment when it was required was not dependent on anyone else being present to register that you'd made it. She had made it in a room full of people who were not watching her. She had made it anyway. She left the press conference before the questions began because she had said what she needed to say to the record, and the questions were for other people to answer. She walked out through the lobby and through the glass doors of the DA's building and back onto Calder Street, into the October afternoon that was colder now than it had been this morning and still clear. She walked. She had no particular destination. She was due back at the Federal Medical Center at 4 to check on Reyes's final discharge preparation, which was happening today, which meant he was well enough to leave, which was the clinical outcome she'd been working toward since the moment she'd pushed her way back through the trauma bay doors. That gave her an hour and 40 minutes, and she used some of it walking and some of it sitting on a bench in the small park 2 blocks from Calder Street, watching the city move. She thought about what Reyes had said on the phone that morning, about visibility, about doing the work when no one was watching. She had spent most of her life in institutions, the military, the field, and then civilian medicine, which was its own kind of institution with its own architecture of hierarchy and assumption and the particular weight of other people's certainty about who you were based on what you looked like. She had spent most of that time navigating the gap between what she knew and what the people around her were willing to credit her with knowing. She had not fixed that gap on the 3rd of October. The gap existed. It would continue to exist. There would be other rooms where her age and her face and her title would arrive before her actual self did, and she would have to work in the space around that again. That was not a problem with a single resolution. It was a condition of a world that organized itself by appearance before it organized itself by evidence. But what had happened on the 3rd had shown her something she hadn't been certain of before, that the gap between being seen and being effective was navigable, that invisibility, which had felt like a liability for 6 months, had also been a form of freedom. She had operated without anyone managing her or anticipating her moves or understanding what she was looking at until she had already acted on it. The same oversight that had dismissed her had also left her room. She had used the room. She thought about Veldon and the 13-year-old her son had been when the network found him. She thought about Holt, chosen for his reliability by people who intended to use it against the patient in his care. She thought about Sandra, who had moved a boot because she'd heard something too smooth in a woman's voice, and who had been right because 14 years of institutional work had calibrated her to the difference between genuine and performed. She thought about Solon, who had come into a building to ensure a man died and had instead ensured the opposite, because something had shifted when he'd watched a young nurse smell the air around a dying man and recognize what no one else could name. People were complicated. The institutions they built were complicated. The systems that were supposed to protect the right people and constrain the wrong ones were imperfect in ways that sometimes failed catastrophically. And the people operating inside those systems were imperfect in ways that sometimes made them instruments of the failure without knowing it. The answer to that was not cynicism. She had seen what cynicism did to people who carried it long enough. It made them smaller. It made them careful in ways that narrowed rather than protected. And it made them stop trusting their own reading of a room because the room had disappointed them enough times that they'd stopped expecting it to make sense. The answer, as far as she had been able to work it out, was something closer to what Sandra had done. To stay calibrated, to keep listening for the difference between genuine and performed, to act on what you heard even when the cost of acting was not clear in advance, and to document everything. That last part was not romantic, but it was real. The documentation she had done in the controlled substances log, her name, the date, the time, the medications, the reasoning, had been the anchor of everything that followed. It had been the basis for Breyer's case file, and for Holloway's press conference, and for the public record that would outlast all of them. She had made that record in the middle of a crisis, in the 2 minutes she'd had while loading a tray, because she understood that evidence was the currency of institutions, and that without it, the truth of what had happened would be whatever the most powerful people in the room said it was. She was not the most powerful person in any room she'd been in this week. She had the documentation. The balance of power in the end had organized itself around that. She got up from the bench. She put her hands in her jacket pockets and walked in the direction of the Federal Medical Center through the October afternoon of a city that was going about its business without knowing what had moved through it 3 days ago and what the week had cost and what it had, in the accounting of things that were difficult to account for, produced. She had a meeting on Monday that would change what her days looked like. She had a contract in her pocket that was a different kind of institutional relationship than the one she'd had at Harlow General. Not better in every way, not without its own architecture of hierarchy and assumption, but clear about what she was and what she knew and what she was being asked to bring to the work. She was 23 years old. She had been in rooms that had tried to define her by that and had found that the definition didn't hold under pressure. That was enough to know. She walked into the Federal Medical Center at 3:47 and took the elevator to the 3rd floor and came through the access point where an agent checked her name against a list and nodded her through. And she walked the corridor to Reyes's room and knocked twice and pushed the door open. He was sitting up. He was dressed in civilian clothes. Someone had brought him clothes. Or he'd arranged it. She didn't ask. He looked like himself in a way he hadn't looked on the gurney, which was to say, he looked like a man with all of his resources present and organized, rather than a man fighting for the ones he needed to stay alive. He looked at her. "Discharge papers," she said. "Signed an hour ago." "BP?" 110/72. "Adler cleared you?" Reluctantly, he said. She wanted another 24 hours. She was probably right. She was definitely right, he said. "I'm leaving anyway." She almost smiled. "Where are you going?" "Debrief, 3 days, then reassignment." He paused. "Aldrin told me about Monday, your briefing." "Yes." He stood up. He was steady, not completely. She could see the slight deliberateness of the first few steps, the body reasserting its own authority after 4 days of being managed by other people, but steady enough. He picked up a jacket from the chair beside the bed and put it on with the careful movements of a man working within his current limits without pretending those limits weren't there. "You're going to be good at this," he said. "I know. she said. He looked at her. The bluntness of it surprised him, and then it didn't, and something moved through his expression that was close to respect and not trying to be anything else. Good, he said. She walked out with him into the corridor, and they went to the elevator together, and neither of them filled the silence with anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said that hadn't been said already or wouldn't be said in the months ahead in the context of the work they were both going to do. The elevator opened on the ground floor. The lobby was the ordinary lobby of a federal facility. Security desk, badge readers, the kind of lighting that prioritized function over atmosphere. Through the glass doors ahead, the October afternoon was still going, still clear, the light angled now toward evening without having committed to it yet. She walked through the doors. The air was cold and real, and she breathed it in, and for a moment she just stood there, on the other side of the longest week she'd had in 2 years, with the city in front of her and a future that looked different from what she'd been building toward, and the absolute certain knowledge that she had, on the morning of the 3rd of October in the emergency room of Harlow General, been exactly where she needed to be and done exactly what she was there to do. Nobody had seen it coming. She had. That was the thing about doing the work when no one was watching. When the moment came, you were ready for it. Not because you'd prepared for that specific moment, but because you'd been preparing for every moment, consistently, in the space between the recognition you didn't get and the standard you held for yourself anyway. The world would keep organizing itself by appearance. People would keep arriving before their actual selves did, and being evaluated on the arrival. There would be other Raymond Holtz and other Dale Forsyths and other rooms where the wrong assumption about who was standing in front of them would be made and held. There would also be more patience on more gurneys and more moments when the right decision was harder than the wrong one, and more choices to be made in the gap between what was authorized and what was necessary. She had found out, 3 days ago, what she did with those choices. She already knew. She walked forward into the afternoon, and the glass doors of the Federal Medical Center closed behind her, and Denton Falls carried on the way cities carried on, indifferent, continuous, full of ordinary people doing work that mattered more than anyone was watching. And Mara Voss, who had been a floor nurse everyone looked through and was now something none of them had anticipated, kept walking. She had always been moving toward this. She just hadn't needed anyone else to know it to make it true.